Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Underwater fog. Have you ever stared at a lake so still it felt like time itself had stopped? That's what Lake Mistral was like, nestled deep in the forests of Washington State. A mirror of cold, glassy water surrounded by endless rows of towering pines. It was the kind of place you went to escape the world, peaceful, serene, and utterly ordinary. At least, that's what I thought when I arrived. I had rented a small cabin on the lake's edge for a week, hoping to clear my mind after a brutal year. My name's Aaron, by the way, 34, freelance graphic designer, with a knack for overthinking every decision in my life. When I booked the cabin, the reviews said things like, a slice of paradise and perfect for solitude. Exactly what I needed. The first 2 days were uneventful. I'd wake up to the sounds of birds, brew a cup of coffee, and sit on the creaky dock that jutted out into the water. Evenings were spent with a book or sketch pad in hand, sketching the lake and its surroundings. The weather was cool but calm, with clouds skimming low across the horizon. It wasn't until the third morning that I noticed something odd. A faint mist had settled over the lake, not unusual for early autumn, I thought. But this mist was different. It clung to the water like a living thing, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. I stood on the dock, rubbing my eyes and blinking against the pale sunlight. It felt colder than it should have. Just fog, I muttered, shaking my head. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked back at the cabin, a tiny structure of weathered wood and dark windows. The stillness of the morning now felt oppressive, as though the lake was holding its breath. By midday, the mist had thickened. It wasn't just over the water anymore. It had begun creeping onto the shore, wrapping itself around tree trunks and rocks like a pale, gossamer web. The air felt heavy and damp, carrying an earthy, metallic scent that made my skin prickle. I decided to distract myself. Pulling on my hiking boots, I headed up one of the trails that wound around the lake. The higher I climbed, the more I tried to convince myself that the fog was nothing more than a seasonal phenomenon, a trick of light and temperature. But as I reached a clearing overlooking the water, the unease grew. From this vantage point, I could see the entire lake. The mist wasn't dissipating as the day warmed, it was growing denser, spreading outward like ink spilled in water. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me. It was a text from Emily, my sister. Hope you're enjoying your retreat. Call when you get a chance. I didn't respond. Instead, I stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if I should tell her about the fog. She'd laugh, I thought. Foggy weather freaks you out now? I could almost hear her teasing voice. Shaking off the thought, I pocketed the phone and turned back toward the trail. I didn't get far before I heard it. A sound, faint but distinct, carried through the dense air. It wasn't a bird or a rustling branch, nothing natural. It was humming. Low and rhythmic, like the vibrating strings of some unseen instrument. It came from the direction of the lake. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more resonant. My pulse quickened, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Wind? Water? Maybe an animal call? Then, without warning, the humming stopped. I bolted down the trail, nearly tripping over roots and rocks as I raced back to the cabin. By the time I reached the shore, the mist had thickened into an opaque wall, cutting off the lake from view entirely. The once crisp air was suffocating now, and I found myself gasping as if I'd run a marathon. Standing at the water's edge, I tried to calm myself. It's just fog. Nothing else. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Something was wrong with Lake Mistral, and I wasn't ready to find out what. That evening, the mist didn't retreat. It thickened, swallowing the lake, the dock, and even the first few trees near the cabin. I sat inside, staring out the single window, my pulse racing. The glass pane was cold to the touch, as if the mist had drained the warmth from the air. I tried to convince myself to relax. The mist was just weather, wasn't it? I'd been too long in the city, surrounded by noise and lights. Quiet like this, it got to you. My mind was playing tricks. I turned on the cabin's long radio, a crackling old thing sitting on the kitchen counter. Static filled the air for a moment before it settled on a classical station. Violins and cellos hummed softly, their melody filling the space. It didn't help. By 9 o'clock, the mist had pressed itself against the cabin's walls, curling against the windows like eager fingers. I could barely see a foot past the glass. The oppressive silence outside was broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden structure settling under the chill. And then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, a single rap against the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest town. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. Maybe it's just a tree branch. Another knock, this time louder. Heart pounding, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet from the stove. Slowly, I approached the door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and turned the handle. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The mist poured in like a living thing, swirling around my feet and spilling into the room. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the forest beyond obscured by the pale fog. I slammed the door shut, heart hammering against my ribs. For the next hour, I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the skillet like a lifeline. My mind raced with questions. Who or what had knocked? I replayed the sound over and over in my head, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. But then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was the humming. Low and resonant, the sound seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. It wasn't coming from a single direction, it was all around me, inside the mist itself. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It carried an odd rhythm, almost musical, like a chant from a long-forgotten ritual. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I needed to get out of here. Fumbling with my phone, I tried to call Emily. The screen flickered, the battery icon draining unnaturally fast. The call didn't connect. Instead, the phone emitted a sharp burst of static before shutting off completely. That was when the lights went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, the radio's soothing melody replaced by eerie silence. The humming outside grew louder, vibrating the very floor beneath me. I stumbled to the drawer where I'd seen a flashlight earlier. My fingers fumbled over matches, a knife, and finally found the cold, cylindrical metal. Clicking it on, I swept the beam around the room. The mist had crept inside. It coiled along the floorboards, pale and almost liquid, snaking toward me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away, my feet nearly slipping on the damp surface. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the mist parted. In its depths, I saw shapes. They weren't human, at least, not anymore. Twisted silhouettes moved within the fog, their forms indistinct but unmistakably alive. Long limbs, featureless faces, and movements that were jerky yet deliberate. One of them turned toward me. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as the beam extinguished. Darkness consumed me, and the humming reached a deafening crescendo. Something touched my ankle. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and plunging into the mist outside. The cold hit me like a wave, biting into my skin as I ran blindly toward the trail. My only thought was escape, get to the car, get away from the lake, get anywhere but here. The mist seemed endless, its swirling tendrils pulling at my clothes, my hair, my very breath. I stumbled, falling to my knees, but forced myself to keep moving. The humming was behind me now, closer than ever, a chorus of voices whispering just beyond the veil. When I finally reached the car, I flung myself into the driver's seat and fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered, coughing as if reluctant to start. "Come on," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please, please, please." With a shudder, the car roared to life. I slammed it into gear, the tires spinning on the damp gravel before catching traction. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mist was following me. The car skidded as I turned onto the narrow forest road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the thick trees that loomed on either side of the road. But the mist was still there. It slithered after me, a pale, living mass that defied the natural world. No matter how fast I drove, it clung to the car, pressing against the windows like a desperate hand trying to force its way inside. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's not real." The humming hadn't stopped. It resonated deep in my chest, as if the sound were inside me now. I shook my head violently, trying to clear it, but the vibrations only grew stronger. As the road twisted and turned, my headlights caught something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the lane. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt mere feet from the shadowy shape. My breath caught in my throat as I stared. It was a man, or at least it had been. His body was gaunt, his skin pale and translucent, as if he were part of the mist itself. Hollow eyes stared back at me, black voids that seemed to draw in the light. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The figure raised an arm, its movements slow and unnatural, and pointed back toward the lake. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the humming grew louder, vibrating through the car and into my bones. The figure took a step forward, and instinct took over. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning wildly as I backed away from the thing in the road. The mist surged around me, blinding and suffocating, but I didn't care. I had to get away. Spinning the wheel, I managed to turn the car around and floor the accelerator. The engine roared, the speedometer climbing as I raced back down the road, away from the lake and its horrors. But the mist didn't relent. It poured through the trees, chasing me like a living predator. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness fraying as the humming intensified. It was inside my head now, a relentless chorus that drowned out all rational thought. I barely noticed the bridge ahead until it was too late. The car hit the barrier with a bone-jarring crash, the impact throwing me forward as the airbag deployed. Pain exploded in my chest, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the car was silent. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood, and the windshield was cracked but intact. Groaning, I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out onto the bridge. The mist was everywhere, a thick, oppressive wall that swallowed the night. I could barely see the water below, but I could hear it, an eerie, lapping sound that didn't belong to any lake I'd ever known. And then I felt it. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stole your breath. I turned slowly, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't suppress. They were there. Dozens of them. Pale, twisted figures emerging from the mist, their movements slow and deliberate. Their hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking, and their mouths moved in silent unison, as if chanting words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the slick surface of the bridge. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. One of the figures stepped closer, its hand outstretched. The humming grew deafening, a cacophony that seemed to pierce my very soul. "No!" I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat. "Stay away!" But they didn't stop. The mist surged forward, enveloping me in its icy grip. My vision dimmed, the world fading into a swirling void of pale gray. And then, silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. That I had escaped, somehow. But as the cold seeped deeper into my skin, I realized the truth. The mist wasn't just following me. It was consuming me. I don't remember how long I lay there on the bridge, the mist pressing against me like a living shroud. Time had lost all meaning. The humming was gone now, replaced by a suffocating silence that felt worse somehow, like the calm before an inevitable storm. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on the bridge anymore. I was in the mist. It wasn't like standing in fog, it was inside me, around me, everywhere. I couldn't see my hands, my feet, or anything solid. The air felt thick and heavy, each breath like inhaling ice water. At first, I thought I was alone. But then I saw them. The shapes in the mist. They were closer now, their outlines clearer. Their faces, if you could call them that, were grotesque distortions, stretched and blurred as though reality itself had warped. Their bodies seemed to ripple, shifting between forms as they moved. They were walking, they were gliding, carried by the mist like puppets on invisible strings. And they were all staring at me. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "This isn't happening." But it was. The shapes began to circle me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine. My legs trembled as I tried to back away, but there was no escape. The mist tightened around me, its cold tendrils brushing against my skin like probing fingers. "Why?" I choked out, my voice barely audible. "What do you want?" A voice answered, but it wasn't a sound. It was inside my head, a deep, resonant tone that felt like it had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. "You came to us." "I didn't," I shouted, panic surging through me. "I just wanted to get away." "I didn't mean to." "All who come are claimed." The words echoed in my mind, each one a hammer blow against my sanity. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, or whatever passed for ground in this endless void. As I lay there, trembling, the mist began to shift again. It pulled away from me, swirling into a vortex that rose high above my head. The shapes moved with it, their forms blending into the spiraling mass. And then I saw it. The lake. Or what was left of it. The water was black, a thick, viscous substance that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of its own. The mist poured into it, feeding the darkness, and from its depths, something began to emerge. A single, massive shape rose from the water. It was formless at first, a shifting mass of shadow and mist, but as it solidified, my mind screamed in protest. It had no eyes, no face, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy, unrelenting. Its presence pressed down on me like a tidal wave, crushing me under its sheer weight. "You will join us." The voice was everywhere now, a chorus of whispers that filled the void. The figures around me began to dissolve, their forms merging with the towering entity. "No," I gasped, clawing at the ground. I won't. But my body betrayed me. The mist wrapped around my limbs, pulling me toward the edge of the black water. My screams were swallowed by the void, my struggles meaningless against the relentless force. As I was dragged closer, I caught glimpses of faces in the water. Faces I recognized. The woman from the reviews, the fishermen I passed on the road, even the hikers I'd seen in the distance, all of them were here, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with eternal terror. The truth hit me like a thunderclap. No one left Lake Mistral. The mist was the lake, and the lake was alive. It didn't just kill, it consumed, devouring everything it touched and leaving nothing behind. And now, it had me. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was my own reflection in the black water. It was smiling. I awoke to silence. No humming, no voices, no movement, just the crushing weight of absolute stillness. At first, I thought I was dead, drifting in some liminal space where time no longer mattered. But then I felt the cold. It wasn't a sensation on my skin, it was deeper, as though my very soul had frozen. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. My arms, my legs, they weren't mine anymore. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the invisible chains holding me in place. And then I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel them, the others. They were all around me, their presence like faint whispers in the back of my mind. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, trapped in the same void, bound by the same force. "We are one now." The voice echoed inside me, not as words but as pure understanding. It wasn't a single voice, it was many, layered and intertwined, speaking as one. The mist had claimed us. Memories flooded my mind, images of the lake, the cabin, the bridge. My thoughts felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The mist was sifting through them, pulling apart the pieces of my identity and weaving them into its endless fabric. I wasn't just in the mist. I was the mist. The realization hit me like a wave, drowning me in despair. My body, my name, my very sense of self, all of it was dissolving, becoming part of this ancient, consuming entity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Time passed, though I couldn't tell how much. Days? Months? Years? It didn't matter. All that existed was the mist and the black lake at its heart. And then I felt it. A new presence. Somewhere far away, footsteps crunched on gravel. A faint light pierced the edge of the mist, a flashlight carried by someone who didn't yet understand the danger they were walking into. Another. The voice rippled through the mist, a wave of anticipation that spread like wildfire. I felt it too, the pull, the hunger. I wanted to warn them, to shout at them to run, but the mist wouldn't let me. My world wasn't my own anymore. I was a part of it, and it was a part of me. The figure grew closer, their silhouette barely visible through the swirling fog. A man, young, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He called out, his voice trembling. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The mist responded, curling around him like a welcoming embrace. The humming began again, faint at first but growing steadily louder. I watched as he hesitated, his flashlight beam darting nervously through the haze. He didn't see us, yet. I could feel his fear, his confusion. It resonated through the mist, feeding the ancient entity that now controlled me. And then I saw my reflection in the mist, faint but undeniable. My face, my eyes, but twisted, hollow, and devoid of humanity. I wasn't me anymore. The mist surged forward, and I surged with it, a silent predator drawn to its next prey. He turned, but it was too late. His scream echoed briefly, swallowed by the mist. And then, silence. Lake Mistral remains quiet, its surface undisturbed, its secrets hidden beneath the swirling fog. And the mist waits for the next one. Whispering Peaks. The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, a relentless force that seemed to carry whispers on its icy breath. I paused mid-step, clutching the straps of my backpack, and turned to glance at my climbing partner, Alex. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the roar. Alex stopped beside me, adjusting his scarf against the biting cold. His dark eyes skimmed the craggy peaks that surrounded us. "Hear what?" I hesitated, unsure how to describe the sound. It hadn't been a voice, not exactly. More like a faint melody, almost human but distorted, as though the mountain itself were singing. "Nothing," I muttered, shaking my head. We were on the final stretch to the summit of the Whispering Peaks, a remote cluster of jagged cliffs in Colorado. The locals had warned us about the unpredictable weather and the treacherous trails, but we were seasoned climbers, drawn to the challenge and the mystery. The peaks were infamous for their strange acoustics. Climbers often reported hearing voices carried on the wind, though no one could agree on what they said. Some dismissed it as an auditory illusion, a trick of the wind against the rocks. Others claimed it was something more, something ancient. "Let's keep moving," Alex said, tugging at my sleeve. The path ahead narrowed to a precarious ledge, barely wide enough for one person. Beyond it, the valley plunged into a mist-shrouded abyss. My heart quickened as I stepped onto the ledge, the void yawning beneath me. Each step felt like a test of willpower. The wind seemed to grow stronger, buffeting us with invisible hands. I gritted my teeth and focused on the icy rock beneath my boots, willing myself not to look down. And then I heard it again. A voice. This time, it was clearer, cutting through the wind like a knife. A single word, drawn out and heavy with meaning. "Tom." I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. "What is it now?" Alex called from ahead, his voice tinged with irritation. "There's something calling," I stammered. He frowned, his brow furrowing. "It's just the wind. Don't psych yourself out." But it wasn't just the wind. I knew it wasn't. The voice had been real, impossibly real. And it hadn't come from above or below, but from within the mountain itself, as though the rock and snow were alive and watching. We pushed onward, the summit drawing closer with every labored step. The air grew thinner, each breath a struggle against the altitude. My legs burned with exertion, but the voice kept pulling me forward, an invisible thread I couldn't ignore. When we finally reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. A sea of white-capped peaks stretched to the horizon, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The wind had calmed, its whispers replaced by eerie stillness. Alex dropped his pack and let out a triumphant whoop, his voice echoing off the surrounding cliffs. We made it, but I couldn't share his excitement. My gaze was fixed on the towering rock formation at the heart of the summit, a jagged spire that seemed to defy gravity, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the snow. The voice was louder here, though Alex didn't seem to hear it. "Seek. What is that?" I whispered, pointing to the spire. Alex followed my gaze, his expression skeptical. "Just a rock formation. Probably formed by erosion or something." But it wasn't just a rock. I stepped closer, drawn to its uneven surface. The air around it felt different, charged, almost electric. As I reached out to touch it, a sharp gust of wind slammed into me, knocking me back. "What the hell?" Alex grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. Before I could answer, the ground beneath us trembled. It was faint at first, a subtle vibration that quickly grew into a bone-rattling quake. "We need to get out of here," Alex shouted, his voice laced with panic. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my eyes locked on the spire as the voice rose to a deafening crescendo. "Seek the truth." And then, as abruptly as it began, the quake stopped. The stillness that followed was more unsettling than the chaos. Alex was shouting at me, but his words were muffled, as though we were underwater. My ears rang, and my vision blurred. In the silence, the spire seemed to pulse, its surface shimmering like liquid stone. And then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, etched into the rock like ancient carvings, their expressions twisted in pain and fear. Their eyes seemed to follow me, hollow and unblinking. "What are you looking at?" Alex demanded, shaking my shoulder. I pointed to the spire, my hand trembling. "The faces, don't you see them?" But Alex only looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "There's nothing there," he said firmly. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. The faces were real. And they were watching. The descent from the summit should have been a relief, but every step felt heavier than the last. The voices followed me, their words fragmented and unintelligible, but their intent unmistakable. Alex walked ahead, his movements brisk and purposeful. He hadn't seen the faces, and he hadn't heard the voices. To him, the mountain was just another climb, another summit conquered. "Come on, we need to make it back to camp before dark," he called over his shoulder. I nodded but said nothing. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment when I touched the spire. The sensation had been more than physical. It was as though the mountain itself had reached into me, unearthing something primal and raw. As we navigated the narrow ledge we crossed earlier, the wind returned with renewed vigor. It wasn't the same chaotic gusts as before. This wind was deliberate, almost rhythmic, carrying faint whispers that seemed to circle us. I stopped, my breath hitching. "Alex," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. He turned, his expression a mix of annoyance and concern. "What now?" "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" I gestured toward the cliffs around us. The whispers were everywhere now, their words overlapping in a haunting cacophony. "It's voices. They're coming from the wind," I said, my heart pounding. Alex's frown deepened. It's just the wind whistling through the rocks. Stop letting your imagination run wild. But it wasn't just the wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. A single word emerged from the chaos, spoken in a dozen overlapping tones. Return. I staggered back, my hand gripping the cold rock for support. We need to leave, I said, my voice trembling. Alex sighed, rubbing his temples. That's exactly what we're doing. Now, keep moving before it gets any worse. The trail descended into a narrow gorge, its walls steep and shadowed. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. The air grew colder, each breath a plume of frost. And the voices didn't stop. They grew clearer, their words more distinct. They weren't calling me anymore, they were speaking to each other. They see us, one voice whispered. They don't belong, said another. I froze, my legs refusing to move. Alex noticed and walked back toward me. What's wrong with you? You've been acting weird ever since we reached the summit. They're watching us, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Alex rolled his eyes. Who's watching us? There's no one here but us. But he was wrong. As the wind shifted, I saw them, faint, translucent shapes moving along the cliffs above us. They weren't human, not exactly. Their forms were vague, ever-shifting, like shadows caught between dimensions. Do you see them now? I asked, my voice breaking. Alex followed my gaze, but his expression didn't change. There's nothing there. The shapes grew closer, their movements fluid and unnatural. They didn't walk, they glided, their forms merging with the rocks and snow as though they were part of the mountain itself. One of them stopped, its featureless head tilting in my direction. And then, for the first time, I felt its gaze. It wasn't a physical sensation, but an invasive one, as though something was peeling back the layers of my mind, exposing every thought, every fear. I stumbled backward, clutching my head. Stop it! I shouted, but I wasn't sure if I was talking to the shapes or the voices. Alex grabbed my arm, his grip firm. You're losing it. We need to get out of here now. But the shapes weren't letting us go. The wind surged, its force nearly knocking us off our feet. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Run! Alex shouted, dragging me forward. We sprinted down the trail, the gorge narrowing around us. The shadows deepened, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The voices pursue us, their words echoing in my mind. You can't escape. You belong to us. We reached a clearing, the trail splitting into two paths. Alex hesitated, glancing between them. Which way? He demanded. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the cliffs above, where the shapes had gathered, their forms writhing like smoke caught in a storm. Which way? Alex shouted again. The voices answered for me. Left. I pointed to the left trail, my hand trembling. Alex didn't question it. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the path, his movements frantic. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going exactly where the mountain wanted us to go. The left trail twisted and turned, its surface uneven and slick with ice. The shadows grew thicker, swallowing the faint light of the fading day. Each step felt like a gamble, the ground beneath us threatening to give way at any moment. Alex was ahead of me, his pace hurried but steady. I struggled to keep up, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The whispers followed us, growing more coherent with each passing moment. This way, closer, deeper. I didn't dare look behind me, though I could feel them, the shapes, the watchers, gliding silently through the darkness. Their presence was a weight pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. "We're almost there," Alex called, though I wasn't sure where there was. The trail widened abruptly, opening into a cavernous hollow surrounded by towering cliffs. In the center stood another spire, taller and more jagged than the one at the summit. Its surface shimmered with an unnatural light, a faint, eerie glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Alex stopped, his eyes fixed on the spire. "What is that?" he murmured. The voices were louder now, their words merging into a chant that resonated deep within my chest. "Return, restore, release." I stepped forward, drawn to the spire despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The air around it was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. My hands trembled as I reached out, the urge to touch it overwhelming. "Don't," Alex said sharply, grabbing my wrist. I turned to face him, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "Whatever this is, it's not normal," he said. "We need to leave. Now." But the mountain had other plans. The ground beneath us shook violently, knocking us off our feet. A deep, guttural rumble echoed through the hollow, like the growl of a waking beast. The spire pulsed brighter, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. And then I saw them. The faces from the summit etched into the spire's surface. They were clearer now, their features twisted in agony. Their hollow eyes seemed to plead with me, though I couldn't understand what they wanted. "What is this place?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the wind returned, whipping through the hollow with terrifying force. The shapes emerged from the shadows, their forms more defined now. They moved with purpose, circling us like predators closing in on their prey. Alex scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting between the shapes and the spire. "We have to go." But I couldn't move. The voices were inside my head now, their chant a relentless drumbeat. "Release us, fulfill the cycle, become one." The spire's light grew blinding, and the faces began to move, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Alex grabbed my arm, shaking me. "Snap out of it. We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The ground beneath the spire cracked open, a deep fissure spreading outward like a spider web. From within came a sound that defied explanation, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The shapes surged forward, their forms coalescing into a towering figure that loomed over the spire. It was neither man nor beast, its body a shifting mass of shadow and light. Its hollow eyes fixed on me, and I felt the full weight of its gaze. "Run!" Alex shouted, pulling me toward the edge of the hollow. We sprinted toward the trail, the wind howling around us. The ground shook with every step, the fissures widening and swallowing chunks of rock and ice. Behind us, the figure let out a soundless roar, its presence filling the hollow like a storm. The spire's light flared one last time before it shattered, sending shards of glowing stone flying in every direction. We barely made it back to the narrow trail before the ground gave way entirely, collapsing into a dark, endless void. I didn't stop running until we reached the tree line, the whispers finally fading into the distance. Alex collapsed beside me, his chest heaving. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The faces, the voices, the towering figure, it was all still burned into my mind, an inescapable nightmare. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The safety of the tree line was an illusion. Even as Alex and I leaned against the rough bark, gasping for air, the mountain's presence lingered, oppressive and unyielding. The wind had died down, but the silence that replaced it was worse, thick and unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. "What do we see back there?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to form the words. The images of the towering figure and the glowing spire replayed in my mind, vivid and unrelenting. "We need to keep moving," Alex said, pulling himself upright. "The sooner we're off this mountain, the better." But as we stumbled through the dense forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, and every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through my body. The voices were gone, but the memory of them lingered, their chants still echoing in my mind. "Release us, fulfill the cycle, become one." "What do you think they meant?" I asked, breaking the silence. Alex glanced at me, his expression guarded. "What who meant?" "The voices," I said, my words trembling. "The shapes. Whatever that thing was at the spire." Alex hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. All I care about is getting out of here alive." But the mountain wasn't done with us. The trail grew steeper, the trees thinning as we descended. The ground was treacherous, covered in loose rocks and patches of ice. Alex moved quickly, his focus on the path ahead, but I lagged behind, my steps hesitant. It wasn't just the terrain slowing me down. My body felt heavier with each step, as though the mountain itself was pulling me back. My chest ached, my head pounding with a rhythmic thrum that matched the pulsing light of the spire. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. "You can't leave." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Alex," I called, my voice barely audible. He turned, his face etched with frustration. "What now?" "Do you hear it?" I asked, my eyes darting around the shadowed forest. Alex's expression softened, concern replacing his annoyance. "Hear what?" I didn't answer. The whisper came again, louder this time, and unmistakably close. "You belong to us." The shadows at the edge of my vision moved again, and this time I saw them clearly. The shapes were back, their translucent forms gliding silently between the trees. "Run," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What?" Alex asked, his brow furrowing. "Run," I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. We sprinted down the trail, the forest blurring around us. The shapes followed, their movements fluid and relentless. They didn't chase us, they herded us, steering us toward an unseen destination. The path twisted sharply, and Alex stumbled, nearly falling. I caught his arm, pulling him back to his feet. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice hoarse. The trees thinned abruptly, and we found ourselves at the edge of a cliff. Below, the forest stretched out endlessly, a sea of darkness broken only by the faint glimmer of distant stars. "We're trapped," Alex said, his voice filled with despair. The shapes emerged from the trees, their forms solidifying as they approached. They surrounded us, cutting off any chance of escape. And then the wind returned. It wasn't the chaotic gusts from before, nor the rhythmic whispers. This wind was alive, a tangible force that pressed against us, pushing us closer to the edge. The towering figure from the spire appeared again, its massive form rising from the shadows like a phantom. Its hollow eyes fixed on me, and I felt the weight of its gaze once more. Alex stood frozen, his face pale. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice trembling. The answer came not from me, but from the voices. "You." The figure raised a hand, its shadowy fingers stretching toward me. The wind surged, and I felt myself being pulled forward, the edge of the cliff only steps away. "No!" Alex shouted, grabbing my arm. But the mountain's pull was stronger. The ground beneath my feet crumbled, and I fell into the void, the wind's howling filling my ears. And then everything went silent. I awoke to a suffocating darkness. My body felt weightless, suspended in a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no sound, no light, only the faint sensation of cold pressing against my skin. I tried to move, but my limbs were unresponsive, as though they didn't belong to me anymore. Panic set in, my mind racing to piece together what had happened. The mountain, the whispers, the fall, it all came back in fragments, each one more horrifying than the last. Then, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a distant glow that pulsed rhythmically, like the heartbeat of some great, unseen creature. As it grew brighter, I realized it wasn't a light at all, but the spire. It stood before me, impossibly tall and glowing with the same eerie energy as before. The faces were still there, etched into its surface, their expressions twisted in eternal agony. And they were watching me. A voice spoke, deep and resonant, echoing through the void. "You have come, as they all must." "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The spire pulsed, and the faces shifted, their mouths moving in unison. "We are the mountain. We are the wind. We are the cycle." I struggled to understand, my mind reeling. "What do you want from me?" The light from the spire flared, and the void around me seemed to ripple. The shadows emerged from the darkness, their forms fluid and ever-changing. They circled me, their movements hypnotic, and I felt the same pull as before, a force that demanded surrender. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I won't be a part of this." The voices laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed endlessly. "You already are." The shadows closed in, and I felt them seep into me, their presence like ice coursing through my veins. Images flooded my mind, countless others who had stood where I stood, their lives consumed by the mountain, their souls bound to its endless cycle. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the void. But then, amidst the chaos, a new voice emerged. "Fight it." It was Alex. His voice was faint, barely audible, but it was enough to break through the mountain's hold. I focused on his voice, clinging to it like a lifeline. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering as though they were losing substance. The spire's light dimmed, and the void began to collapse, the darkness closing in around me. "No!" the voices roared, their unity breaking into chaos. With a final surge of will, I pushed back against the shadows, their grip on me loosening. The void shattered, and I felt myself falling once more, the wind rushing past me as the world came back into focus. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and disoriented, before a familiar face appeared above me. "Alex," I gasped, relief flooding through me. He helped me to my feet, his eyes scanning me for injuries. "You're alive," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how. The mountain was silent now, its presence faded, but I could still feel its mark on me, a lingering weight that would never fully disappear. As we made our way down the mountain, the forest was eerily still. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer moving at the edges of my vision. But I knew the mountain wasn't finished. It never was. By the time we reached the base, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. The warmth should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I turned to look back at the peaks, their jagged silhouettes etched against the morning sky. The mountain watched, silent and unyielding, as it always had. As it always would. Lost World. It began with a rumble. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, vibrating through the floorboards of my small apartment in downtown Chicago. At first, I thought it was just a passing truck or some construction work nearby, but then the tremors intensified, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The rumble escalated into a roar, the ground beneath me convulsing as if the city was about to tear itself apart. The tremors reached their peak, and with a deafening crack, the entire building seemed to shudder. I grabbed the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself, but then, suddenly, everything stopped. The world became eerily still. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest giving way to a strange, gnawing feeling of unease. What had just happened? I glanced around the room, the broken picture frames and scattered books evidence of the chaos the quake had caused. But it wasn't the damage inside my apartment that caught my attention, it was the sky outside. A dense, unnatural fog had settled over the city, thick and impenetrable, blanketing everything in a heavy, suffocating haze. The streets were eerily empty, with no sign of life except for a few straggling pedestrians moving through the mist in a dazed stupor. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the balcony, squinting against the fog. The air felt wrong, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. That's when I noticed it. A series of cracks had appeared in the ground below, running in all directions like veins on a leaf. They pulsed with a dim, unnatural glow. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness of the cracks, when I thought I saw something move, something large and shifting just beneath the surface. I pulled back, heart racing, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it some kind of aftershock? A result of the earthquake? But why were there no reports yet? Why was everything so silent? I reached for my phone, dialing a number without thinking. It was only then that I realized the phone lines were down. No signal. The entire city had been cut off from the outside world. I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to process the bizarre turn of events. That was when I heard the first scream. It was distant at first, barely audible over the thick fog, but it was a scream of pure terror, one that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. My stomach lurched. The scream was followed by more, each one growing louder and closer. The fog around the city thickened, and through the haze, I could make out the outline of people running from something, but I had no idea what. Then, the ground beneath me trembled again, not with the force of an earthquake, but with something else, something deliberate. The cracks in the earth widened, and from the depths of the fissures, something began to rise. I stepped back in horror as an enormous structure emerged from the ground, dark and ancient, as if it had been buried there for centuries. The stone was slick with moisture, and strange, glowing symbols were etched along its surface, pulsing with an unnatural light. The air hummed with a low, vibrating noise, almost like a heartbeat. And then, the fog parted, and I saw them. Figures. They were moving through the mist, slowly and deliberately, their faces obscured by shadow. They were not human, but they moved with purpose toward the newly revealed structure. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet remained frozen in place, as if the earth itself was holding me there. The figures got closer, and my eyes adjusted to the dim light. They were tall, their forms long and spindly, with skin that shimmered like oil in the light. Their faces, if you could call them faces, were obscured by strange, featureless masks. But their eyes, if you could call them eyes, were wide, black voids that seemed to stare straight into my soul. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but nothing made sense. This wasn't just an earthquake. This wasn't just some natural disaster. It was something far older. Something far worse. The ground shifted again, and I stumbled back, my body finally responding to the panic. But it was too late. The fog was closing in, and the figures were getting closer. The fear that had taken root in my chest twisted, and I turned to run. But there was nowhere to go. The city was consumed by the fog, the strange structure rising up like a dark monolith. And in the distance, I could hear the echoes of more screams. It was then that I realized I wasn't just trapped in this city. I was trapped in something far worse. Something ancient. Something alive. I ran. My legs carried me through the mist, but with every step, the fog seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. My breath came in short gasps, each inhale laced with panic. The city, which had once been full of life, now felt like a forgotten world, consumed by an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant screams and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the earth. The cracks in the ground pulsed beneath my feet, and I couldn't help but feel as though the city itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the strange figures trailing behind me. But there was nothing. The mist had swallowed them whole. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, something far worse than whatever had emerged from the cracks. I didn't know how I knew this, but the air around me seemed charged with an eerie energy, as if something ancient had been awakened. I found my way to the edge of the city, where the streetlights flickered dimly in the fog. The buildings were eerily quiet, their windows shattered or covered in grime, as if no one had lived here in decades. I could feel the weight of the atmosphere, like a heavy blanket pressing down on me. My phone was useless, no signal. I couldn't reach anyone. And then, I heard it again, the screeching, panic cry that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I followed the sound, my legs carrying me without thinking, until I found myself at the foot of a massive building. A large sign read, "Research Facility, closed for maintenance." The door was ajar, and beyond it, darkness stretched into what seemed like an endless hallway. I hesitated. A part of me told me to keep running, but another part, a darker, more curious part, urged me forward. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. My breath turned to mist as I moved deeper into the building. The place seemed abandoned, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air, like something had been here recently. Something was watching me. As I walked deeper into the facility, I passed rows of metal filing cabinets, their doors slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry. Dust and debris were scattered across the floor, but the strange thing was there were no signs of anyone actually living here. It was like the place had been forgotten, left to rot beneath the earth. Then I heard it. A low, grinding noise, like stone scraping against stone. The ground beneath me trembled again, this time more violently than before. I staggered, my hand bracing against the wall for support. The grinding grew louder, until the entire building seemed to groan with the weight of something large and heavy shifting beneath the foundation. I stumbled into a darkened room, my eyes straining to adjust. The room was empty, save for a single, large metallic door at the far end. I could feel it calling to me, the same irresistible pull that had drawn me here in the first place. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the cold handle. What was on the other side? What had caused the ground to quake like this? Was there more to the building than I had seen? The answers were just beyond that door, but fear gnawed at me, telling me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, almost cavernous, and filled with shadows. At first, I thought it was just a dim light, but then I saw it, the flickering of something moving in the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me, sealing me in. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. As my eyes adjusted to the low light, I could make out the shape of massive, rusted machinery in the corners of the room, long abandoned. But the most unsettling part was the hole in the center of the floor, a vast, gaping pit from which emanated a faint glow, like a fire burning deep within the earth. I inched closer to the pit, my breath catching in my throat. From the depths, I heard a whisper, a voice, soft and insistent, calling to me. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as if coming from a great distance. Come closer. I stumbled back, my pulse quickening. Was it real? Or was I losing my mind? My thoughts began to spiral as the whispers grew louder, clearer, more urgent. It was as if something, or someone, was reaching out, trying to pull me into the pit. Suddenly, the ground shook violently again, throwing me to the floor. The pit seemed to widen, its edges cracking as though the earth itself was splitting open. The voice grew louder, no longer a whisper, but a command. Come, find me. I crawled backward, heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. But the floor was buckling beneath me, and the walls began to tremble. The air was thick with pressure, as if the entire building was about to collapse. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I saw it, something moving in the shadows. Figures. More of them. They were tall, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were the same as the ones I had seen outside, their masked faces now clear in the low light. I could feel their presence growing closer, like a wave crashing over me. There was no time. I had no choice but to run. The door was locked. Desperation gripped me. I hammered on it with my fists, but the figures were already upon me, their hands cold and skeletal. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Then, everything went black. I woke up in darkness, disoriented and unable to move. My limbs felt heavy, as if the weight of the earth had settled on me. My heart pounded in my chest, but the sound of it seemed muffled, distant, as if I were submerged underwater. Slowly, my senses began to return, and I realized I was lying on a cold, hard surface. I took a shallow breath, my lungs burning from the air, which was thick with dust and the faint scent of rot. The air seemed to press against me, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The walls around me felt close, almost suffocating. Panic gripped me, but I fought it back. I couldn't afford to lose control now. I pushed myself up, my body shaking. My eyes strained to adjust, but there was nothing, just an endless black void. Where had the pit gone? Where were the figures? The cold was still there, though, wrapping itself around me like an oppressive shroud. I tried to stand, but my legs refused to cooperate. I felt as though I were trapped in a nightmare, the world shifting and distorting around me. Then, faintly, I heard it. The whispers. Soft, like the rustling of wind, but unmistakably there. The same voice, calling out from the depths. Come closer. I froze. It was impossible to tell where the voice was coming from, but it felt closer now, almost as if it were inside my head. I took a cautious step forward, trying to steady my breath. The ground beneath me was uneven, and the air thickened with each movement I made. My feet scraped across something gritty, like sand or dirt, but it felt wrong, too soft, as though it were not supposed to be there. Another step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Come, find me. The words were no longer soft, but urgent, filled with an eerie power that seemed to force its way into my mind. I wanted to ignore it, to turn and run, but something pulled at me, something deeper than fear, something I couldn't explain. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, sharp and jarring. The unmistakable sound of something shifting in the darkness. My pulse quickened. I was not alone. Something was moving toward me. I spun around, straining my eyes, but there was nothing, just the oppressive blackness. And then I saw it. A flicker of light, distant but growing stronger, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. I couldn't see what it was, but it called to me, just as the voice had. I began to move toward it, stumbling over the uneven ground, my breath shallow, my heartbeat erratic. Each step felt like I was wading through thick mud, as if the air itself was trying to drag me back. The light grew brighter with every step I took, until it illuminated something I hadn't expected to see. The walls, no, the ceiling, were covered in intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and move as I looked at them. They were ancient, worn by time, but alive with an energy I couldn't understand. The light wasn't coming from a lamp or a fire, but from the symbols themselves, glowing faintly, pulsating with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I reached out to touch them, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone. The moment I made contact, the floor beneath me trembled, and the light flared brightly before fading back into its soft glow. I recoiled, my mind racing. What was this place? What had I walked into? Come closer. The voice was louder now, almost deafening, as though it was coming from every direction at once. I pressed my hand to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my mind now, invasive and impossible to escape. I had to get out. But the ground beneath me shifted again, violently this time, throwing me off balance. I crashed to the floor, my face scraping against the rough stone. The walls groaned, a low, deep sound that rattled my bones. The symbols began to shift, moving as if they had a life of their own, spiraling inward toward the center of the room. The whispers rose to a crescendo, blending into a single, unified voice that felt like it was choking the air around me. Come, find me. And then, I saw it, something in the center of the room, beneath the light. A figure, standing motionless, its back to me. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its body seemed to distort with the shifting symbols. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its hands reached out toward me as though beckoning me closer. I could feel the pull of it, the undeniable force drawing me in, despite every instinct telling me to turn and run. I had to know. I had to understand. I stood, my body trembling, and took one step forward. The figure turned. Its face was a mask of shadow, a void where features should have been. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two swirling black voids, endless and consuming. The air grew colder, suffocatingly so, as it reached out toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by something more terrifying than the darkness itself. It spoke, its voice a soft rasp, as though it was whispering from the depths of the earth itself. "Why did you come?" I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my lips numb, as if the air itself was draining the life from me. The figure before me was a hollow void, nothingness that seemed to stretch into infinity. It wasn't just a being, it was an absence, a space that didn't belong here. I could feel its presence pressing against me, like a weight too heavy to bear. "Why did you come?" it repeated, its voice impossibly soft yet thunderous, echoing through the caverns of my mind. The sound reverberated in my skull, vibrating through every fiber of my being. It wasn't asking for an answer, it was demanding one. I tried to swallow, but my throat was tight, constricted. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to run back into the darkness from where I had come. But my legs refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force, a grip more powerful than fear itself. "Why did you come?" the voice asked again, this time a whisper, like wind brushing through the ruins of an ancient temple. The words slithered into my ears, coiling around my thoughts, clouding my judgment. I thought of the tremors, the earthquake, the destruction, the tunnels that had swallowed so many others. I thought of my friends, gone, lost in this labyrinth of shadows and whispers. And I thought of the compulsion that had led me here, to this very moment. Had I come seeking answers? No. I had come because something inside me pushed me forward, something beyond curiosity, something more ancient, more primal. Something that felt like a call, a whisper of fate, guiding me toward this terrifying place. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck in my throat, as though the figure before me had stolen my voice. Instead, I heard myself think, my thoughts clearer than ever. I came because I had no choice. The figure's black void swirled, twisting, distorting like smoke in the wind. For a moment, I thought it was going to speak again, but then the room, no, the entire cavern, shuddered violently. The walls groaned, cracking, and the ground beneath me trembled. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide, fear swelling in my chest. What was happening? The figure remained unmoving, its presence more oppressive than ever. The whispering had stopped. Instead, there was a low, rumbling hum that filled the space around me, vibrating through my bones. The light from the symbols dimmed, flickering, as though something in the room was coming to life, stirring from a long, forgotten slumber. And then I saw it, the ground beneath the figure cracked, splitting open in jagged lines that spread outward like veins, pulsing with a sickly green light. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very fabric of reality was bending. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me, drowning out my thoughts. The walls seemed to close in on me, narrowing as if the cavern itself were alive with hunger. The figure remained still, but its form began to shift, to stretch upward, growing taller, more imposing. It was no longer just a shadow, it had substance now, a form that defied understanding. It was as if I was staring at something that didn't belong in this world, something not made of flesh or bone but of something far darker. "Your presence is no accident," the figure finally spoke, its voice dripping with malice. "You have awakened it. You have awakened me." The ground trembled again, more violently this time. I stumbled forward, my knees giving way beneath me, the shaking so intense I could barely stand. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but no sound left my throat. It was as if the very air had been sucked from my lungs. "You were never meant to find this place," the figure continued, its voice now laced with something that was almost glee. "But now that you have, you will be part of it. You will be part of the darkness." I tried to move, to run, but the very air seemed to hold me in place. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear threatening to tear me apart. What was it? What was this place? And why had I come here? Why had I been drawn into its depths? The light from the symbols flashed once more, brighter than before, blinding me. I shielded my eyes, but the light penetrated, searing through my skin, into my soul. And as it did, something shifted inside me. A deep, gnawing sensation began to fill me, like a hunger that had always been there but had never been recognized. It was familiar, this feeling. It was a part of me, hidden beneath the layers of my mind. I understood then, in a way I couldn't explain. This place, this darkness, was not just something I had stumbled upon. It had always been a part of me, a part of all of us. The earth itself, the caves and tunnels beneath our feet, they were not merely a physical space. They were a reflection of something much older, something buried deep inside us all. The whispers grew louder, now more than voices, they were thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. And just as I thought I might lose myself to them, just as I thought the darkness would consume me, the figure spoke once more, its words like a final, crushing blow. "You are lost," it said, and for the first time, I heard pity in its voice. "And now, so am I." And with that, everything went dark. The last thing I heard before everything faded was the echo of the whispers, the same words I had heard before. "Come, find me." I awoke to silence. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that suffocated you, filling every crevice of your mind until there was nothing left but the void. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, smothering my thoughts, making it difficult to even breathe. I opened my eyes, but I could see nothing. I was submerged in darkness, thick, suffocating darkness, as if the very air had solidified into a blanket that was keeping me from moving. My body felt numb, as if I had been lying here for hours, days, or even longer. I tried to move, but the moment I shifted, a sharp pain shot through my arm. My skin felt raw, scraped, as if I had been dragged across rough stone. Panic set in as I forced my body to sit up, my hands pressing against the cold, unfamiliar ground. The stone beneath me was smooth and slick, not like the jagged rocks of the cavern I had been in moments before. Where am I? My pulse quickened, and I tried to steady my breathing, but my lungs felt heavy, as though they too were trapped in the darkness. The air was thick, heavy with a strange scent, damp and metallic, almost like blood. It made my stomach twist in knots. I strained my ears, searching for any sound, any sign that I wasn't completely alone, but the silence remained unbroken. There were no footsteps, no whispers, no tremors in the ground. Just the oppressive weight of stillness. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper. At first, it was barely a breath, a sound so distant I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, this time clearer, more distinct. A voice, soft and unearthly, like the rustling of leaves in an empty forest. "Come, find me." The words sent a chill racing up my spine. It was the same voice I had heard before, the same voice that had echoed in my mind. The figure. The darkness. It was here, still pulling at me, still calling me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stand. My legs were shaky, unsteady, like they hadn't borne my weight in far too long. Every step was a battle, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't just lie there in the dark, waiting for whatever this was to claim me. I had to move. Come, find me. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer. And with it, a sense of urgency, like the voice knew something I didn't. I had no choice but to follow it, whatever it was. I took a deep breath, forcing my eyes to adjust to the impenetrable blackness around me. There was nothing to guide me, no shape, no form, no horizon. Just the oppressive, consuming darkness. I extended my hand, feeling around in the nothingness, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. The whisper came again, now right in my ear, as if it was standing next to me. Find me, or be lost forever. A cold shiver ran down my spine. It was impossible to explain, but in that moment, I felt it, a sense of inevitability. A pull, deep inside me, urging me forward. I had no choice. I had to find whatever this was. Find the answers, find the truth. Or lose myself forever. I stumbled forward, blindly reaching out for something to anchor me. The floor under my feet felt uneven, rough, like the stone of the tunnels, but it was different now. Wetter. Slicker. As though the walls themselves were alive, breathing. Then, the ground trembled beneath me. A low, distant rumble echoed in the darkness, followed by a sudden shaking that threw me off balance. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced. What was that? What was happening now? The rumbling grew louder, more intense. The air vibrated around me, and I felt the faintest tremor beneath my hands, as though the world itself was moving, shifting. The darkness seemed to pulse in time with the rumbling, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Help me. A new voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the same voice as before. It was softer, pleading. I froze, my blood running cold. Who was that? Who else was here? Another whisper, this time closer, more desperate. Please, you have to help me. It was faint, barely audible, but it was real. Someone else, was here, trapped in this dark place with me. But where? Who? The voice seemed to be coming from all directions at once, surrounding me, pressing in from every angle. Help me. The voice repeated, the desperation now tinged with panic. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling as the rumbling intensified, shaking the walls around me. The darkness seemed to pull tighter, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I had to find the source of the voice. But as I moved, something cold brushed against my cheek, a hand, thin and skeletal, but warm, almost alive. My breath hitched, and I recoiled, spinning around, heart racing. Nothing. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The voice came again, louder now, right behind me. Help me. And that was when I realized. The voice wasn't just a call for help. It was a warning. A plea. Someone was trying to keep me here. To pull me deeper into the darkness. The rumbling wasn't just the earth shaking, it was the sound of something awakening. Something old. Something ancient. The whispers, the voices, the cold touch, it was all part of it. It was trying to drag me down into the depths with it. And now, there was no way out. The bell on the hill. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. That was the kind of thing people used to talk about over drinks, something to amuse themselves with after a long week. But then there are moments when your beliefs are tested. When something happens that defies all logic, all explanation. And when it does, you start questioning everything you thought you knew. It all began with a simple, harmless question. Do you want to explore the old cemetery on the hill? I should have said no. I should have known better. But something about it intrigued me, the forgotten stories, the history buried beneath the crumbling gravestones, and the way the place always seemed to be shrouded in mystery, even from a distance. Maybe it was the fact that it had been abandoned for years. Maybe it was the allure of the unknown. Either way, I agreed. The cemetery was perched atop a small hill, isolated from the town below. The road leading up to it was overgrown, forgotten by most. As I climbed the hill, the landscape around me seemed to close in, the trees thinning and giving way to a stretch of dry, cracked earth. The air felt heavy, as if the land itself was waiting for something. For someone. We reached the iron gates at the top. The rusted bars groaned as I pushed them open, the sound grating in the stillness of the afternoon. Beyond the gate was a graveyard lost to time, a place of forgotten souls. The gravestones were weathered, many leaning at precarious angles, some half buried under a blanket of ivy and moss. I could almost hear the echoes of past lives lingering in the wind, as though the air itself carried the weight of all the untold stories. But something else lingered in the air too, a strange, unsettling quiet. Not the normal stillness you'd expect from a cemetery, but something deeper. A heaviness. An expectation. It was as though the ground beneath my feet was aware of my presence. Doesn't it feel off? I asked my friend, Sarah, who was walking a few steps behind. She didn't answer right away. When I glanced back at her, her face was pale, her brow furrowed. But she nodded slowly. Yeah. It feels like the place is holding its breath. I laughed it off, trying to dismiss the tension that had started to creep into my chest. But even as I did, the silence felt more pronounced, like we were intruders in a place that had long been forgotten by the world. We wandered deeper into the cemetery, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The graveyard seemed endless, rows of stones that stretched out into the distance, each one marked with names that had long since faded into obscurity. A few of the older graves had been completely consumed by the earth, their markers hidden beneath a thick layer of dirt and overgrowth. It wasn't until we reached the center of the cemetery that I noticed it, a large stone bell tower, its silhouette dark against the afternoon sky. The tower had long been abandoned, the bell now a rusted relic of a time when it had been used to call the community together. The bell itself was cracked, its surface worn and faded from years of exposure to the elements. Why is that thing still here? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and unease. I shrugged. Probably just a part of the history of the place. Maybe it was used to signal the time of death, or something else. Who knows? I didn't think much of it at the time, but I did feel a strange pull toward the tower. There was something about it that seemed out of place in this forgotten cemetery, something that didn't belong. We made our way toward it, our steps slow and deliberate, as if we were walking through a dream. The air seemed thicker around the tower, the silence more oppressive. As we got closer, I noticed something else. There was a faint smell in the air, like damp wood and earth, mixed with something metallic. It was the smell of decay. When we reached the base of the tower, I stopped. There, on the ground at the base of the bell, was something strange, a weathered piece of cloth, torn and stained. It looked old, like it had been there for years, hidden beneath the grass. My hand reached out instinctively, and as I touched it, a chill ran up my spine. The fabric was cold, unnatural. "Do you think someone left this here recently?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Before I could respond, the air shifted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, rattling the trees and sending a shiver down my spine. The wind was cold, biting, and it carried with it a sound, a distant, faint sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The bell tower began to shake. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just a gentle vibration beneath our feet. But then it grew louder. The faintest ringing. A single chime. A distant, mournful sound that echoed through the cemetery like the cry of a long-lost soul. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to Sarah, but she was already staring up at the bell tower, her eyes wide with fear. Another chime. The sound was louder this time, sharper. And then, silence. The bell had stopped ringing, but the air still hummed with the lingering vibrations. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer. I had no explanation for what had just happened. The bell tower had been abandoned for years. There was no reason for it to ring now, no reason for it to be moving like that. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else. Something that was reaching out from the past. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt as though the ground beneath me was holding me in place, trapping me here with whatever force had awakened the bell. Whatever had been waiting. And then, from the distance, another chime rang out. But this time, it wasn't just one. It was a series of chimes, quick, urgent, like a warning. I knew, then, that we had disturbed something. Something that had been resting here for far too long. And now, it was calling us. The air was thick, suffocating with a silence that pressed against my chest like an unseen hand. My heart hammered in my ears, each beat a frantic reminder of the sudden, unbearable tension that hung between us and the bell tower. The wind had stopped, but that eerie, metallic smell still clung to the air. I looked at Sarah, hoping for some rational explanation, but all I saw was the same terror reflected in her eyes. "What the hell was that?" she repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. It was almost as if she didn't want the words to escape, as though saying them out loud would make it real. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "But there's no way the bell should have rung like that. It's..." Another chime. Louder this time. And closer. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced up at the bell tower, my gaze fixed on the cracked and rusted bell. It swung with an unnatural force, its metal groaning like it hadn't in decades. The wind was still, but the bell was moving as though something, or someone, was pulling it. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The air around us grew colder, the shadows deeper. "Let's go," Sarah urged, her hand reaching out for mine. Her grip was firm, desperate. She tugged at me, her eyes wide with panic, but I couldn't move. It was as though my feet were frozen to the earth. I can't. Something's wrong. And then, like a clap of thunder in the stillness, the bell rang again, closer, clearer, as though it was right beside me. A sharp, mournful sound that rattled my bones. My body shuddered involuntarily. This time, it wasn't a single chime, but a series, quick, relentless, like a countdown. I glanced at Sarah, but she was already pulling away, her eyes locked on the distance behind me. She gasped, her face going ashen. "There's someone there." I spun around, my heart thumping, but there was nothing. No one. The cemetery was still, the gravestones casting long, jagged shadows in the fading light. But the feeling, the sense that something was wrong, lingered in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the bell anymore. It was the ground beneath us, the very air that we breathed. It felt alive. Watching. Waiting. We both stood frozen, our breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence was suffocating now, thick like fog. I could hear my heartbeat, feel the blood rushing in my ears, but all of it seemed distant, muted. The bell had stopped ringing, but the quiet felt wrong. Then, from behind the bell tower, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft that it could have been the wind, but there was something distinct about it. A voice, low, insistent, like the murmur of a prayer long forgotten. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but it was there. I could feel it. Sarah's hand tightened around mine. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, my throat dry, my chest tightening with dread. The whisper grew louder, clearer, and now it was no longer just a murmur, it was a chant. A rhythmic, repetitive sound, like a hymn. But there was something sinister about it. The words felt wrong. The voice was wrong. It wasn't human. The ground beneath my feet trembled, just slightly at first, as though a tremor had passed through the earth. But it wasn't a natural tremor. It felt deliberate, like a signal, a warning. The bell tower creaked ominously, the rusted metal groaning under some unseen force. I tried to move, but the air had thickened, my limbs felt heavy, my body weighed down by an invisible presence. I wanted to run, but it was as if the cemetery itself was holding me in place, keeping me tethered to this place. And then it came. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the whispering growing louder, more frantic, until the air itself seemed to pulse with it. Something was coming. "Run!" Sarah screamed, her voice high-pitched, breaking through the sound of the chant. She pulled me, yanking at my arm, her fear contagious. But it was too late. The ground shifted violently beneath us, sending both of us stumbling forward. I heard the shriek of metal as the bell tower groaned, the bell swinging violently, as though caught in a furious storm. The shadow, no, it was more than just a shadow now, moved, stretching toward us, coalescing into a shape, a figure that was far too tall, far too thin, for it to be human. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with each step I took, my legs refusing to move faster. The ground beneath us seemed to be pulling at our feet, as if trying to drag us back toward the bell tower. The figure grew clearer, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin. It wasn't human, it couldn't be. It was tall, too tall, draped in black, its features obscured by shadows. But I could feel its eyes, watching, waiting. It was the bell. The bell I'd called it here. A loud, echoing chime rang out again, and I thought for a moment that I might pass out. The sound was deafening, the noise pounding against my skull, shaking the very ground beneath my feet. The figure moved again, faster now, closing the distance between us. We ran. We ran without looking back, my heart hammering in my chest as I urged Sarah forward. But with each step, it felt as though we were running deeper into the cemetery, deeper into the tombs of the forgotten, like the land itself was swallowing us whole. And in the distance, I could still hear the bell. Ding, ding, ding. A warning, a cry, and then silence. The silence hit us like a brick wall. One moment, the air was thick with the sound of the bell, ringing its ominous, cruel chimes. Then, suddenly, there was nothing. No wind. No whispers. No sounds of footsteps behind us. Just the oppressive quiet that clung to the cemetery, suffocating us from every direction. I turned to Sarah, my breath ragged, my pulse still racing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she, too, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. We both stopped in the middle of the cemetery path, looking around, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. "What is going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands were shaking at her sides. What the hell was that thing? I didn't know how to answer her. My own mind was a whirlwind of confusion, trying to piece together what had just occurred. The bell had stopped. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished. And now we were left alone, standing in the cemetery, as if the world had simply forgotten about us. The sky above us had darkened, the sun now hidden completely behind a thick layer of clouds. The cemetery, which had once seemed like an ordinary place, was now suffused with an unsettling energy. The air felt wrong, thick with something I couldn't name, but could feel in every breath. I glanced behind us at the bell tower. The silhouette of the structure was barely visible against the darkening sky. The bell that had rung so loudly only moments ago now sat motionless, like an ancient relic, waiting. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Come on." Sarah nodded quickly, but as we turned to leave, I felt it, a sudden pressure, a presence that wasn't there before. It was as if the cemetery itself was pushing back against us. The ground beneath our feet shifted again, just a subtle tremor, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. My eyes darted around, scanning the gravestones. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow flitting between two of the old markers. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Sarah, do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer at first, her gaze fixed ahead, but I could see her shoulders tense. "I saw something move," she said, her voice tight. It was behind that stone." I swallowed, the knot in my stomach tightening. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. It was as if invisible eyes were on us, following our every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the air seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that filled my bones. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. And in that silence, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint at first, a barely audible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then it grew louder, closer, like voices, like a chant. Sarah froze. "It's coming from the crypt," she said, her voice shaking. She pointed to a low, crumbling stone structure off to the side of the path. I hadn't noticed it before. It had been hidden in the shadows, almost as if it didn't belong. The whispering was now a chorus, growing stronger with each passing second. The crypt seemed to pulse with life, the air around it thickening. I could hear the chants clearly now, though they were still unintelligible, like a language forgotten by time. Without thinking, I found myself walking toward it, drawn by some invisible force. My feet moved of their own accord, slow but deliberate, like I was being led by something beyond my control. "Sarah," I called, but my voice sounded distant, as if the very air was swallowing it. I glanced over my shoulder, but Sarah wasn't there. The cemetery was empty. Panic rose in my chest as I whipped around, my breath coming faster, my heart hammering in my chest. "Sarah?" I called again, but all that answered me was the whispering. I didn't have time to look for her. The crypt was ahead of me now, the stone door cracked open just slightly, a faint light spilling from the darkness inside. I could feel the pull, the need to go in. It wasn't a choice anymore, it was a compulsion. As I approached the door, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall, draped in black, his face obscured by the hood of a cloak. The same figure I had seen before. The same one that had been watching us. He didn't speak, but I felt his presence in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. His eyes, hidden beneath the hood, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and I could feel them burning into me, searching, waiting for something. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, but the whispers around me grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from him, from the very air itself. The bell rang again, its chimes like a funeral dirge, and with it, a cold wave of dread washed over me. The crypt door creaked open fully, revealing the darkness inside. The light that had been spilling out was no longer warm. It was cold. Dead. Something in the pit of my stomach told me I didn't want to go inside. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward. The figure didn't move to stop me. He simply watched. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air seemed to press down on me, heavy and suffocating. I took a few more steps into the crypt, my feet dragging, the whispers growing louder, rising up in a crescendo. They filled my head, drowning out everything else. And then, from deep within the crypt, I heard a voice. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. "Sarah." The whisper echoed in my mind, but it wasn't just a whisper. It was a call. A beckoning. The figure stepped forward, its shadow lengthening, and I realized I wasn't alone. The crypt wasn't empty, and neither was the cemetery. The bell rang again, louder this time. And this time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a command. Ding, ding, ding. The moment the bell rang again, its sound seemed to echo from every corner of the crypt. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was an overwhelming force, a vibration deep in my chest, as if the earth itself were being torn apart. Each chime rattled my bones, made the very air tremble around me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The whispers had stopped, but they were replaced by a deep, hollow sound, like the sigh of something ancient, something far older than I could comprehend. The figure in front of me shifted, its form seeming to stretch and contract in the dim light, like it was made of shadows themselves. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The cold in the crypt grew more intense, each step I took deeper into the cavernous space, making the temperature drop further. My fingers ached from the chill, my skin tightening with a sense of something wrong, something terrible that I couldn't escape. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to scream. But my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the floor, my legs stiff with fear. The figure took another step toward me, its movement slow but deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. "Do you hear them?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing in the corners of the crypt. It was not the same as the whispering, it was deep, guttural, like it belonged to something not of this world. It was the sound of lost souls, of those who had never been allowed peace. I opened my mouth, trying to speak, but the words were stolen from me. My thoughts were racing, spinning in circles, trying to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, twisting into shapes that weren't there, figures that seemed to move just out of my sight. And then, there was a sound, a scraping noise, faint at first, like metal dragging across stone. My eyes darted toward the far end of the crypt, where I saw a faint glow, the same eerie light that had spilled out from the door when I first entered. Something was moving in the dark, something that wasn't supposed to be alive. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling. Her name felt like a plea, a desperate cry into the void. I needed her, but I was more and more certain that she was no longer here with me. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and from the shadows, something emerged, an old, rusted bell. It was large, hanging from the ceiling, and it swayed as if moved by an unseen hand. Its surface was corroded, covered in the grime of centuries, but there was no mistaking its shape. It was identical to the one that had been ringing outside, the one whose sound had haunted us from the beginning. But this bell was not alone. From the darkness around it, figures began to materialize, crawling from the walls like spiders from a nest. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, their forms twisted and broken. They were not human anymore, not in any real sense. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and vacant, as if trapped in a perpetual state of terror. The sight of them sent a chill through my veins, paralyzing me in place. Each figure seemed tethered to the bell, like they were drawn to it by some invisible force. And as they moved closer, I realized with horror that their movements were synchronized with the ringing of the bell, as if they were dancing to its twisted tune. I had to get out. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't move. I was trapped. The figure in front of me, its face still hidden beneath the cloak, stepped forward once more, and I felt the weight of its gaze on me. Its presence seemed to press down on me, suffocating me with an invisible weight. And then, in a voice that was both a command and a plea, it spoke again. "Join them." The words vibrated through me, cutting through the haze of fear in my mind. The figures were getting closer now, their twisted hands reaching for me, their eyes unblinking, their faces frozen in agony. I could see the desperation in their movements. This was not something they wanted to do. They were trapped, bound by the bell, just as I was. "Join them," the figure repeated, its voice low and resonant, like the bell itself. I tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy, as if the weight of the bell's call was pushing down on me, forcing me to obey. I could feel my body trembling, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. The figures were upon me now, their cold fingers brushing my skin, and I could feel the deathly chill of their touch seep into my bones. The bell tolled again. Ding. I felt the ground beneath me shift, the crypt itself seeming to move, to twist, as though the walls were closing in. The shadows stretched out, long and dark, surrounding me on all sides. The figures' faces were now inches from mine, their eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't understand, a longing, a desperation, a fear that mirrored my own. The bell tolled a final time. Ding. And everything went black. I woke with a start, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. My head was spinning, my body aching with a dull, insistent pain that radiated from deep within. My fingers twitched, and I could feel the dirt beneath me, cold, rough, and wet. It took a few moments for my senses to clear, for my heart to stop hammering in my chest. But something was wrong. The familiar smell of the crypt, the thick, musty air that had filled the space around me, was gone. Instead, I could smell the earth, fresh, damp, and rich, like the soil of a forest floor after a rainstorm. The silence was profound, almost suffocating. No more bells, no more scraping, no more whispers. I sat up slowly, my legs feeling weak beneath me, but they held. I could see nothing but darkness, and yet I knew I wasn't where I had fallen. The air was colder now, but not like the freezing chill I had felt before. This cold was different, an unnatural kind of stillness, a sensation that made my skin crawl. I reached out, my hand brushing against something rough and jagged. The sensation was almost comforting, like the stone walls of the crypt, but this wasn't stone. It was bark, ancient and gnarled, like the trunks of trees that had stood for centuries. I was outside. A wave of confusion hit me. How had I gotten out of the crypt? What had happened after the bell tolled? The last thing I remembered was the darkness closing in, the figures surrounding me, their cold hands reaching out. And then, nothing. Just the tolling of the bell. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky but determined. I couldn't stay there. I had to find out what was happening, had to understand why I was now in this strange place, so far from where I had last been. The trees around me loomed tall and silent, their branches tangled and thick, blocking out most of the sky. The ground was soft beneath my feet, as if it hadn't been disturbed in ages. I took a few steps, glancing around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. There was no sign of the crypt, no path back to where I had been. The landscape felt unnatural, as if it were a forgotten part of the world that had slipped between the cracks of time itself. My breath quickened as panic began to rise in my chest again. Where was I? I turned in a circle, looking for something, anything, that could guide me. But the only thing I saw were the trees, their dark silhouettes casting long shadows. There was no sign of civilization, no roads, no buildings. Just endless woods stretching out into the darkness. And then, through the silence, I heard it. The faintest of sounds. A whisper. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a product of my mind still reeling from the horrors of the crypt. But no, it was there again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A voice, like a breath on the wind, murmuring something that I couldn't quite catch. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go toward it. Every part of me screamed to turn and run. But the pull was irresistible. There was something drawing me toward that whisper. Something familiar. I pushed through the thick underbrush, each step dragging me deeper into the heart of the forest. The whisper grew louder, clearer, though still just out of reach. It was a voice I should have known, a voice that seemed to belong to me, yet distant, as if it were not my own. Sarah. I froze. That was my name. But there was no one else here, no one but me. The voice came again, closer this time, and I could swear I felt it brushing against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. Sarah. I started to move again, faster now, my footsteps quickening as the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were no longer still. They creaked, groaned, as if something was moving through them, pushing their branches apart to make way. The ground beneath me shifted, too, as though it were alive, twisting and turning with every step I took. And then, I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing just beyond the tree line, illuminated by a pale, unnatural light. It was a woman, though not one I recognized. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but her posture was familiar, straight, almost regal, with an air of quiet authority. She stood perfectly still, her presence both calm and unnerving at the same time. Sarah, the voice called once more, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it was more urgent, more desperate. I stepped forward, drawn to her, my heart racing in my chest. Her voice, had a strange pull, as if she were calling me home. But as I took another step toward the figure, a cold realization swept over me. I knew her. I had seen her face before. It was the figure from the crypt. The one who had warned me. The one who had led me into the darkness. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I was still trapped. This forest, this place, was no escape. It was a continuation of the nightmare. The bell, the figures, the crypt, it had all been real. And now, this woman was waiting for me, just as they had waited before. I took a step back, fear rising in my chest. But it was too late. The moment I moved, the ground beneath me shifted once more, and everything went black. The bell tolled again. Ding. And I knew, deep down, that it would never stop. The underground labyrinth. The air in New York City had grown oppressive, thick with the humidity of a late summer afternoon. But there was no sweat on my brow, no unease in my chest. Not yet. I had prepared for this day for years. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, and I am an archaeologist. I've spent most of my life studying the ancient world, its secrets, its mysteries, its long-forgotten wonders. But nothing in my career had prepared me for what lay beneath this city. The discovery had been entirely by accident. We were supposed to be investigating a routine excavation of a pre-Columbian site when we stumbled upon an entrance to something far older, something that should not have been there. A tunnel, a shaft that led deep below the city's foundations. And it was not on any map, nor did it appear in any historical records. We entered the labyrinth beneath the streets of Manhattan with little more than a few tools and a burning curiosity. The team was small, just a few of us, 3 archaeologists, a historian, and a surveyor. We thought we were on the verge of discovering something spectacular, something monumental. We had no idea how wrong we were. At first, everything seemed normal, even exciting. The tunnel was narrow but tall enough for us to walk upright. The walls were covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols, and the air was cool and musty, as if it had been sealed off for centuries. But as we ventured further, something began to gnaw at the back of my mind. It was an irrational feeling, but it was there, an instinctive sense that something was terribly, horribly wrong. We'd been walking for hours, the narrow walls closing in around us as the light from our flashlights flickered and stretched in eerie shadows. The only sounds were the echoes of our footsteps, the occasional scrape of a tool, and the distant hum of the city above. Then, a faint sound reached my ears. At first, I dismissed it as the usual creaks of the shifting tunnel. But it grew louder. A whisper. A low, almost inaudible murmur. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The others were too caught up in their own excitement to notice, their voices rising as they discussed the ancient markings on the walls, speculating about the origin of the structure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone froze. The historian, Dr. Emily Webb, looked at me quizzically. "Hear what?" I didn't respond immediately. I was straining to listen, trying to place the sound. It was faint, almost like a breath, but there was something in it, something unsettling. There it was again. A hiss, followed by what sounded like distant scratching, like claws dragging against stone. I felt my skin crawl. "We should turn back," I said, my voice shaking. I don't like this. But no one listened. They were too caught up in their fascination with the walls, too eager to continue down into the unknown. "You're being paranoid, Nathaniel," said Emily, brushing a lock of hair out of her face. "It's just an old tunnel. There's nothing down here." But her words didn't comfort me. In fact, they made my unease grow. It was as if she were trying to convince herself as much as me. Against my better judgment, I followed them deeper into the maze. But as we rounded a corner, the tunnel widened into a cavernous space. It was enormous, a vast, underground chamber lit only by the dim light of our torches. And there, in the center of the room, stood an ancient structure, a pedestal, carved from what looked like black stone, its surface covered in intricate patterns. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it. Something alive. As I stepped forward, a low hum filled the air. It came from the pedestal, resonating through the stone like the vibrations of a long-forgotten voice. I could feel the hairs on my neck stand on end, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to leave. "Do you feel that?" asked the surveyor, Mark, his voice tense. I nodded, though I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just the physical sensation of the hum. It was something more, a pull, a beckoning force that seemed to call to me, urging me to get closer. Before I could speak, Emily stepped forward, her hand reaching toward the pedestal. "We have to document this," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. Her fingers brushed against the surface of the stone, and the moment she made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the hum intensifying until it felt like the very walls were vibrating around us. A deep, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, followed by a violent tremor that rattled the floor beneath our feet. The pedestal began to glow, a sickly green light pulsing from the center of the stone, spreading outward in waves. I shouted for Emily to move back, but it was too late. The light exploded outward, engulfing her, and in that instant, she was gone, swallowed by the blinding flash. The others screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening roar that filled the chamber. I tried to run, tried to escape, but the very ground beneath me seemed to shift and collapse, as if the tunnel was alive, feeding off our panic. And then, silence. I was alone. The pedestal had stopped glowing, but the room had changed. The walls, once smooth, were now covered in cracks, as though the entire structure had been altered in an instant. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, the only sound in the stillness. I knew then that I had made a grave mistake. Something in the labyrinth had been waiting for us. And now, it had taken one of us. But it wasn't finished. I stood frozen in the center of the chamber, my mind racing, my body numb. The others were gone, lost in the blinding light, or worse, consumed by whatever force had awakened in that dark, forgotten place. I felt it, the weight of something pressing down on me, the oppressive silence suffocating. But worse than the silence was the feeling, a gnawing sensation at the edge of my consciousness, as though unseen eyes were watching, waiting. I could still hear Emily's scream echoing in my ears, despite the silence that now reigned. I wanted to shout, to call out to her, but the words felt hollow. What could I say? How could I explain that I hadn't just found this labyrinth, we had awakened it? The stone beneath my feet seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. The chamber, once immense and welcoming in its dark majesty, now felt claustrophobic. The air had thickened, turning cold, so cold it burned as it touched my skin. I tried to shake the feeling, to focus, but the walls seemed to close in on me with each passing second. I forced my feet to move, to step away from the pedestal, but something tugged at my mind, stay. It whispered like a breeze I couldn't hear but could only feel, curling around me, binding me to this place. And as I glanced around, I realized that something had changed. The room, the entire labyrinth, I now knew, was not as it seemed. There were shapes in the shadows. No, not just shadows, figures that seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of my vision. Each time I turned my head, they were gone, only to reappear moments later, closer than before. I couldn't be imagining it. Couldn't be. The labyrinth had come alive, and it was feeding on my fear, drawing me into its depths. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into something unknowable. And then the sound came again. At first, I thought it was my own breath, but no. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging itself across stone, slowly, relentlessly. I whipped around, scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows. Just the vast emptiness. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that I was tired, shaken by the horror of the last few moments. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something was moving in the dark. Something was in the labyrinth with me. Emily, I whispered, the name slipping from my lips like a prayer. My voice sounded small, helpless, but it echoed back to me with an eerie twist. There was no answer, only the lingering sound of movement, the scrapping, now louder, closer. My pulse quickened. I glanced around, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight strapped to my belt. It flickered and buzzed, like it was fighting to stay on, then blazed to life with a sharp, electric snap. I turned it on, sweeping the beam across the chamber, illuminating the walls. The symbols that had once intrigued me now seemed to shift in the light, their patterns changing, reforming into something more sinister. I couldn't focus long enough to make sense of them. My eyes kept darting back to the dark corners where the figures lurked. There was a deeper feeling now, one I couldn't shake. The labyrinth was no longer just an abandoned relic of the past. It was a living, breathing thing. And it was hungry. I had to leave. I took a step back, then another. My mind screamed at me to turn around and run, but my legs refused to obey. The only thing I could focus on was the sound, the dragging, scraping sound that seemed to be growing louder by the second, now accompanied by an awful, wet noise, like something breathing heavily, too close. And then, something brushed against my leg. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but again, there was nothing there. No figure. No movement. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of it bearing down on me from all sides. The walls closed in further, the narrow corridors stretching out before me like teeth, ready to devour me whole. I had to escape, but the way out, the way I had come in, had vanished. The tunnel was shifting, reconfiguring itself, as though the labyrinth was alive and constantly rearranging its passages, keeping me trapped. Stay close. You're not alone. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very stone that now seemed to breathe, to pulse with a life of its own. My heart skipped a beat. That voice was not my own. It was deeper, more ancient. I could feel it inside my mind now, seeping into my thoughts, twisting them. I had to get out. I had to leave. But every step I took, the labyrinth closed in tighter, forcing me deeper, further down, where I had no idea what lay waiting. Was this a trap? Had I been lured in, doomed from the start? I looked back to the center of the chamber. The pedestal. It still stood, a silent, ominous sentinel. And that green glow? It was gone. But I could still feel its presence, deep inside me, a weight at the pit of my stomach. Then I heard it, something unmistakable. A voice. Not one I recognized, but one that seemed to rise from the depths of the labyrinth, from the very earth itself. Leave now, Nathaniel, or join us. I froze. The voice was clearer now, echoing in my ears, in my mind. My own thoughts blurred as the fear washed over me like a wave, drowning me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt as though they were made of lead, glued to the cold stone floor. And in that moment, I understood. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze. It was a prison. And the prisoners weren't just trapped here, they were waiting for new souls to join them. A shrill scream echoed from the darkness, cutting through the silence like a blade. And it wasn't my voice. It was Emily's. The labyrinth had taken her, and now it was coming for me. I ran, though I had no idea where I was going. My feet were pounding against the cold, uneven stone, the sound of my steps a constant reminder that the labyrinth was not just a physical structure, it was alive, breathing, shifting, pulling me deeper. Every turn I made seemed to lead to another dead end, or worse, another corridor that spiraled into darkness, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against me. Leave now, Nathaniel, or join us. The voice had been clear, unmistakable. Emily's scream still echoed in my ears, but it was fading, blending with the strange whispering that seemed to fill the air, a murmur just beyond comprehension. The labyrinth was changing again. The walls, once solid, now seemed fluid, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. I was being swallowed whole. My mind raced. Could I fight it? Could I escape this place? I felt the weight of something ancient and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. It wasn't just the maze itself, it was the souls trapped within it. The others. The ones who had been lost before me, their voices now woven into the very stone. You cannot leave. You are already ours, the voice whispered again, closer this time, like a breath against my ear. I spun, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing. Just shadows, long, creeping, slithering shadows that stretched across the walls, twisting and writhing like tendrils. They seemed to mock me, curling around the edges of my vision before vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. It wasn't the darkness that terrified me anymore, it was the feeling of being watched. I could feel them lurking just out of sight, their presence like 1,000 eyes upon me. I knew they were there, hidden in the labyrinth's folds, their shapes barely perceptible, but real. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet trembled. A low rumble vibrated through the stone, like the labyrinth was groaning, waking from a deep slumber. And then came the sound, a dragging, scraping noise that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't alone. I pressed on, my breath shallow, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. The walls, once smooth and well-carved, now felt jagged, sharp, as if the labyrinth was reshaping itself, a grotesque reflection of its own ancient, twisted desires. The passages were narrowing, squeezing me into tighter and tighter spaces. The air was growing colder, colder still, until it was biting at my skin. I could see my breath. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, larger than the rest, lurking just at the end of the tunnel. It was not like the other shapes I'd seen. This one moved. It was alive. I stopped dead in my tracks. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the shadow. It flickered, the beam of light shaking, as though the labyrinth itself was trying to snuff it out. The shadow lurched forward, and I was sure for a moment that it was coming for me. It was a figure, a person, or something that resembled one. The outline of a man, but no man I ever seen before. His features were distorted, warped, as though his form was being bent and reshaped by the labyrinth itself. His face was blank, pale. His eyes, there were no eyes. Just deep, endless hollows, dark as the maze. I could feel my pulse racing, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a ghost, it was a creature. A being created by the labyrinth, forged from the very fear and pain of those it had consumed. Nathaniel, it whispered, a voice like dry leaves crumbling in the wind. You're too late. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but the terror paralyzed me, holding me in place. The figure took another step forward, and then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. It was getting closer. Join us, Nathaniel, it crooned, its voice thick with malice. Join us in the endless night. I staggered back, my body shaking with fear, my mind scrambling for an escape. There was no way out. I was trapped, caught in the labyrinth's grip, with no hope of salvation. Emily's face flashed in my mind, her eyes wide with terror. Had she screamed like this? Had she been drawn into this nightmare too? I glanced around, desperate for any way out. But the passageways, the walls, the labyrinth itself, it was closing in, suffocating me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the stone groaning in protest, like the entire structure was alive and pushing me deeper into its heart. And then, in the distance, I heard it again, a sound. A faint, muffled cry, barely audible over the scraping of stone. Emily. I wasn't alone. She was still here. I wasn't sure how, but I knew it. The labyrinth had taken her, but it hadn't consumed her entirely. There was still a chance. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound, my legs pumping beneath me as I hurtled down another passage. The shadow behind me didn't follow, not yet. It seemed to wait, to watch, content to let me lead it to her, to bring it closer to its prey. The hallway I ran through was darker now, the flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, the stench of long dead things. But there was a light ahead, faint but real. I pushed forward, heart hammering, hoping against hope that I could reach her. The maze was shifting again, but this time I felt the pulse of something else in the walls. A heartbeat. A rhythm that seemed to guide me. I turned a corner, and there she was, Emily. But she wasn't alone. There was something standing next to her, something tall and dark, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It was watching me. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure turned, slowly, its empty eyes locking onto mine. The darkness seemed to swallow it whole. Join us, the voice whispered again. And this time, it wasn't just in my mind. It was behind me. And it was closing in fast. The walls seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart as I stood there, frozen, staring at the shadowed figure next to Emily. The cold air bit at my skin, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My throat tightened, but no sound escaped, no scream, no plea for help. The figure, the thing next to her, was something monstrous. Not human, not even close, its limbs too long, its body too twisted. It was as if it was a part of the labyrinth itself, shaped by its ancient, malevolent forces. Emily's face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She didn't move, didn't speak. It was like she was frozen in time, trapped in whatever horrible state the labyrinth had put her in. The thing beside her, its features indistinguishable in the dim light, reached toward her. It didn't touch her, but the air around her seemed to warp, to distort, as if something was feeding off her fear, pulling her into itself. And then it turned its attention to me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The sound of my breath was the only thing I could hear, shallow and quick. But then, the creature stepped forward, and the ground underfoot seemed to tremble in response. It was closer now, too close. The hollow eyes that stared at me felt like they were reaching into my very soul, dragging my worst fears into the light. The labyrinth didn't just trap people, it consumed them, and now it was reaching for me, drawing me in, pulling me toward it. The voice came again. Not a whisper this time, but a growl, deep and guttural. It filled my head, resonated through my very bones. Join us, Nathaniel. Join the others, join the endless darkness. It wasn't Emily's voice anymore. It wasn't even human. It was the labyrinth, speaking through the figure, through whatever was left of the souls it had devoured. It was trying to take me, to pull me into the same twisted existence it had created for itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The terror was so overwhelming, I felt as though I might lose my mind. But then, just as I thought I might collapse under the weight of it all, I heard her voice. Nathaniel. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakable. Emily was still in there. She was still alive. I snapped my head toward her, my eyes scanning the dark labyrinth. The thing beside her didn't react, its form still indistinct, its limbs stretching unnaturally long. But Emily, she was moving. Slowly, painfully, like she was trying to break free from some invisible force. Emily, don't! I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't seem to hear me, or perhaps she couldn't, her eyes glazed over, unfocused. But then, as if she felt the shift in the air, her head snapped toward me. And for a moment, I saw her, really saw her. The Emily I knew, the one who had come down into this nightmare with me, desperate for answers. But it wasn't enough. Not enough to break the spell that the labyrinth had cast on her. The creature moved again, closer, and my legs screamed for me to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. Suddenly, Emily's body lurched, as though something invisible had gripped her. Her hand stretched out toward me, fingers shaking, but the light in her eyes, had gone dark. Hello. Nathaniel, help me. I shook my head. I had to save her. I couldn't lose her, not like this. But how? The labyrinth was everywhere. The walls, the passages, they were changing faster now, shifting in impossible directions, trapping us further. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest piece of stone, some broken fragment of the labyrinth structure, and raised it high. I had no plan. I had no idea what I was doing. But I was not going to let this thing take her. Not without a fight. The creature didn't flinch as I hurled the stone toward it. It didn't even move. And then, the walls screamed. Not with sound, but with a pressure, an overwhelming force that crushed in on me, on all of us. The air thickened, the temperature dropping further until my breath was visible in sharp clouds. I felt a rush of dizziness as the walls pulsed, as if the labyrinth itself was alive, reacting to the presence of something, a threat, a disruption. And then, everything stopped. The creature, Emily, the labyrinth, they all froze. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then, the floor beneath me gave way. I barely had time to react as the ground cracked open, plunging me into darkness. My body twisted and turned as I fell through the labyrinth's floor, down into an even deeper level of the maze. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the growing roar of the collapsing stone. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body, but I was still alive. Somehow. I didn't know where I was, but I knew this. I was not alone. The walls here were different. The air was thicker, heavier. The very stone around me felt wrong, as though it was alive, watching. And then, in the darkness, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl. "Welcome to the heart of the labyrinth, Nathaniel." I spun toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just darkness. But I wasn't alone. Something else was here. Something far worse than anything I had seen before. And it was watching me. The growl echoed around me, reverberating off the damp stone walls. My heart raced, hammering in my chest, but I couldn't move. Fear had rooted me to the spot, like I was a prey animal, frozen in the gaze of something much larger than myself. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and oppressive, and I strained my ears, trying to hear anything, any sign of what lurked just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to take a step forward, but the ground underfoot felt unstable, shifting beneath me. The labyrinth was no longer just a structure, it was alive. I could feel it in the air, in the stone, in the very space around me. It was watching. Waiting. I was alone. But was I truly alone? I clenched my fists, the sharp edge of the broken stone digging into my palm. I had to keep moving. Emily. Emily was still out there. I couldn't afford to fall apart now. With a deep breath, I forced myself to move. My steps were slow at first, cautious. The ground was uneven, and the walls felt unnaturally close. I kept my eyes scanning the blackness, every flicker of shadow a potential threat. Then, I saw it. A faint light in the distance, barely perceptible at first, like the glow of some unseen fire. The labyrinth was pulling me toward it. It wanted me to come closer, to step into its depths. But I had no choice. There was no turning back. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze, it was a trap, and it was closing in. I took a step, and then another. The air grew colder still, the faint glow intensifying as I moved. I had to reach it, had to see what it was. Maybe it was the way out. Maybe it was the key to ending all of this. The walls began to change. The stone grew smoother, the jagged edges disappearing, replaced by finely cut stone. The rough, ancient surface transformed, almost as if it were made to feel welcoming. But there was nothing welcoming about this place. It was an illusion, a trick of the labyrinth to lure me deeper. Emily. I whispered her name, the sound of it swallowed by the oppressive silence. No answer came. I quickened my pace, the dim glow now becoming more pronounced. It flickered like a candle, casting long shadows along the walls. As I approached the light, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. And then, before I could stop myself, I rounded a corner, and there it was. A door. It was carved into the stone, ancient, yet strangely well preserved. Symbols I didn't recognize were etched across it, winding in patterns that seemed to move while I wasn't looking directly at them. My pulse raced, a sudden wave of dread washing over me. The light was coming from beyond it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would be the worst mistake of my life. It's not too late. The voice came again, softer now, but unmistakable. It wasn't Emily. It was the labyrinth, the entity that controlled it all, that had drawn me down here. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to take control of my mind, my thoughts, like it was whispering directly into my brain. But I was so close. I had to open it. I had to know. But what if it's a trap? The doubt gnawed at me, but the need to know, the need to end this, to understand, pushed me forward. My hands trembled as I reached out to the door. A cold gust of wind, unnatural and harsh, slammed against me. The door creaked, and then, as if the labyrinth itself had decided it was time, it opened. The sight beyond it took my breath away. The room stretched out in front of me, vast and cavernous. The floor was made of smooth, polished stone that seemed to shimmer under the pale light. In the center, suspended in the air, was a massive stone pillar carved with the same strange symbols that adorned the door. They pulsed with an eerie glow, casting shadows that twisted and flickered like living creatures. And standing at the base of the pillar was a figure. At first, I thought it was Emily. But as I took a step forward, I realized it wasn't. The figure was tall, its body twisted and disfigured, its limbs too long, its face shadowed and grotesque. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were empty sockets, black as coal. The creature, the thing, slowly turned toward me. I froze. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was deep, reverberating in my skull like an echo in a cavern. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, pushing against my mind, trying to take over. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as though the very ground beneath me had anchored me in place, trapping me in the center of the labyrinth's heart. The thing stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it was struggling to hold itself together. It raised a hand, and I saw the jagged claws, sharp as knives, glinting in the dim light. And then, the ground trembled. The labyrinth wasn't just alive, it was hungry. I had no idea what was happening. The walls started to close in, the ceiling lowering, the entire room shrinking around me, suffocating me. The creature moved closer, its jagged mouth opening in a soundless scream. And then, as it reached for me, I felt the floor collapse beneath my feet. Everything went dark. The storm from the other side. I remember the first storm. It wasn't like any storm I had ever witnessed before. I'd lived in Ohio all my life, and I had seen my fair share of thunderstorms, those long, rumbling sessions of nature's power, with rain and lightning filling the skies. But this was different. It started late one evening, when the air was still and the night had settled too quietly over the woods. My name is Jack, and I was working late in the lab that night when a sound outside caught my attention. It was a low rumble at first, like distant thunder. The storm was supposed to be miles away, according to the weather report. I checked my phone again to be sure, but there was no storm in sight. Still, the rumble grew louder, and I could feel the tension in the air, a heaviness I couldn't quite explain. I shrugged it off at first. It was probably just one of those atmospheric shifts, the kind that people in the area talk about when they get caught in unusual weather. But then, it hit. The thunder crashed so violently, so unnaturally, that it made the entire house shake. The windows rattled, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest. It was almost like an earthquake, but it wasn't the ground moving. It was the air. I went to the window and pulled back the blinds. The sky was a deep purple gray, the clouds swirling in tight circles like a vortex, as though something immense was brewing just above the horizon. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees like a feral animal on the hunt. Something was wrong. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the wind biting at my skin. The storm was still miles away, yet the air was thick with energy, charged with something I couldn't put my finger on. As I made my way toward the woods, I noticed that the birds, usually so active at dusk, were silent. There wasn't even a rustling in the leaves. The woods had become an eerie, unnatural stillness. And then I saw it. The storm wasn't just a thunderstorm. It was a vortex, a swirling mass of clouds, lightning, and something else, a dark, unnatural energy that pulsed with each strike of thunder. It was moving closer, but not in the way a storm typically would. It was as if it was pulling the world in with it, dragging everything toward its center. I felt my heart race as the temperature dropped drastically in an instant. My breath fogged in front of me, and the feeling of dread crawled up my spine. I turned back toward the house, but something stopped me, a sound. A soft, low hum. It came from the storm, but it wasn't the sound of wind or rain. It was a vibration, a resonance that seemed to reverberate through my bones, through the very air around me. I knew it wasn't natural. No storm sounded like that. As I hesitated, trying to gather the courage to move, I heard something else, a faint whisper, almost as if someone were calling my name from within the storm. Jack. It was a voice, but it wasn't mine. It was distant, echoing, and cold. My name was drawn out, stretched thin by the wind, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I strained my ears, but there was no answer. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming pull toward the storm, as if it were beckoning me. I knew I shouldn't go any closer, but curiosity, and something deeper, darker, inside me, urged me forward. It was then that the first flash of lightning struck, so close, so blinding, that I had to close my eyes. The thunder followed, not as a crack, but as a roar, like something massive breaking apart. When I opened my eyes again, the landscape around me had changed. The woods, the house, everything was different. The trees, once full of life, now twisted at strange angles. Their bark was dark and cracked, like they had been scorched by fire. The ground beneath my feet felt soft and uneven, like something had been eroded away beneath the surface. I could hear the faint sound of crackling, almost like static, in the air. The sky above was no longer a storm, it was a storm and something more. The lightning now pulsed in rhythmic patterns, and the thunder no longer rattled the air, it seemed to come from within the earth. I backed away slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The storm was no longer just a phenomenon, it was alive, and I felt its presence closing in around me. Then, I saw it. A figure. In the distance, standing just at the edge of the storm, where the shadows met the light, was a silhouette, tall, thin, and barely visible. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just watched. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the figure remained still. Jack. The voice came again, clearer this time, closer, unmistakably coming from the figure. But it wasn't just a voice, it was something more. Something ancient, something that was beyond the limits of human comprehension. I didn't know if I could take it anymore. My legs felt like they might give way beneath me, and my mind raced in panic. But somehow, I stayed rooted to the spot as the storm advanced and the figure began to move toward me. There was no way out. And the storm wasn't just a storm anymore. It was something else, and it was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The wind, like an invisible hand, was pressing down on me, pushing me into the ground, threatening to make me crumble under its weight. The air was thick with something otherworldly. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was sharp, like ice slicing through my skin, yet I couldn't feel it physically. It was more like a sensation deep in my bones, as if something was inside me, tugging at the very core of my being. The figure, the one I had seen standing at the edge of the storm, was moving closer now. It didn't walk. It didn't need to. Its legs didn't bend, its body didn't sway. It simply shifted, gliding over the uneven ground as though it were part of the very atmosphere itself. My body screamed for me to run, but my feet were frozen, locked in place. Every instinct told me to get out of there, but the pull of the storm, of whatever force this was overwhelming. "Jack." It called again. This time, the voice sounded closer, clearer, almost like a command. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought it would burst. I took a step back, but the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The figure was so close now I could see its outline more clearly, but I still couldn't make out any details. There was something about it that was wrong, a distortion in its shape. Its edges seemed to flicker in and out of focus, like a mirage that didn't quite belong to this world. I could feel its gaze, but I couldn't tell where its eyes were. It was as if it was watching me from every angle at once, an overwhelming presence that surrounded me. I heard the crackle of lightning again, followed by a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't thunder, it was deeper, darker, like a growl from within the earth itself. The ground trembled beneath me, and I had to clutch at the dirt to keep from falling over completely. I forced myself to my feet, my mind racing for any explanation. A dream? A hallucination? A trick of the wind? No. There was nothing in nature that could create something like this. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was an invasion. A tear in the fabric of reality itself. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape was fluid. Its limbs seemed to stretch and contract as though they were made of smoke, swirling in and out of existence. It had no facial features that I could recognize, just a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Who? What are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It felt like I was speaking into the void, my words swallowed by the weight of the storm. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it raised one long arm, pointing toward the sky. The clouds above swirled faster, the storm growing more violent. The lightning intensified, flashing with such force that it lit up the entire landscape, blinding me for a split second. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The air seemed to pause, holding its breath. And then, something shifted in the atmosphere, like a crack, and suddenly the sky was different. The storm had opened up, revealing something else, something beyond what I could comprehend. I stared at it, my mind struggling to understand. It wasn't just the storm. It was a hole, a rift, a tear in the sky itself. The clouds twisted around it like a vortex, but through the rift, I could see something else entirely. The landscape beyond it was dark and strange, like an alien world that I couldn't recognize. The figure's voice, if you could even call it that, broke through my thoughts. "It is time." The words didn't make sense, but I understood their meaning deep in my gut. Something was happening. Something terrible. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a gateway, and the figure wasn't just a being, it was a guardian, or perhaps something worse. It was waiting for something. I didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like hours, though I knew it had only been moments. The figure was now directly in front of me, and I could feel the intensity of its presence pressing in on me. The storm's howling wind was deafening, and yet I could hear it clearly, the voice. It wasn't speaking to me anymore, but into my mind. You have to decide. I didn't know what to decide. The air was too thick, too suffocating, and my mind was spinning. All I could do was stand there, staring into the rift, unable to turn away. The figure raised its arm again, as if to gesture me toward the hole in the sky. And then I felt it. The pull. The undeniable pull, like gravity itself had shifted, like the storm was sucking me in, slowly at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. I could feel the ground beneath me slipping away, as if the earth itself was being torn apart. My body screamed to resist, to fight, but the pull was too strong. And then, as if I was being dragged into another world, the last thing I saw was the figure's face, or rather, the lack of one. A smooth, featureless surface, absorbing the light, taking away everything around it. Then, darkness. And the storm continued to howl. The cold was unbearable. I couldn't tell if I was standing or lying down. It felt as if I was floating in darkness, suspended in an unending void. My heart raced, my breaths shallow and quick, each one echoing in my ears like the frantic beat of a trapped animal. The sensation of being pulled, of being dragged across an unseen chasm, was still there, lingering, though the storm had stopped. I opened my eyes, though I didn't remember closing them. The world around me was wrong. The sky above was a deep, unnatural purple, swirling with faint traces of lightning. That arced across the atmosphere like ghostly fingers reaching for something hidden. It wasn't a storm, it was something more alive. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as if it were no longer my own. The ground beneath me was soft, almost marshy, but there was no earth, no soil, only a slick, black surface that gave way beneath my weight. I stumbled forward, catching myself on what felt like stone, only to realize it wasn't stone at all. It was organic, pulsing with a strange, low hum, as if the ground itself were breathing. Panic surged through me. My throat tightened, my stomach churned. I had no idea where I was. What was this place? It was alien, unnatural, and yet familiar in a way that sent chills down my spine. The air tasted strange, almost metallic. I reached up to touch my face, expecting to feel dirt, maybe sweat, but instead, my skin felt different. Tingling. I wiped my hand against my cheek and saw it, black veins running beneath my skin, crawling just under the surface like something trying to escape. My fingers trembled as I traced them. Suddenly, the ground rumbled. The hum I had felt earlier intensified, and a ripple of energy passed through the air, distorting the very fabric of the world around me. I looked up, terrified, and saw the rift in the sky had shifted. It wasn't a hole anymore. It was a window, framed by dark, twisting tendrils of energy that wrapped themselves around the air like thick vines. I tried to move toward it, to get a closer look, but something stopped me. A force, like invisible hands, gripped my limbs and dragged me back. I struggled, but I was held in place, the air thickening, growing colder, until every breath was a fight. My chest tightened painfully as I struggled to free myself, but nothing worked. I was trapped. You shouldn't have come here. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't like the voice of the figure. This was a presence, one that seemed to seep into my thoughts, filling every empty space with an oppressive weight. I froze, my heart pounding as the voice washed over me. You've crossed the boundary, Jack. There's no going back. I gasped. The figure. It was speaking to me, but not with words, through thoughts. I could feel the weight of its presence, even though it wasn't standing beside me, wasn't even near me. It was everywhere. In the air. In the ground. In the sky. This is not your world. You do not belong here. My mind raced. The storm, the rift, it had brought me here. But why? What was this place? What did it want from me? The voice seemed to be waiting for an answer, but I couldn't speak. There were no words for what I felt. There were no words for this place. This dimension. The earth trembled again. This time, the hum of energy didn't just ripple through the ground. It pulsed, like the beating of a massive heart, thrumming with a power that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. My entire body shuddered, my teeth chattering as I tried to hold myself together. But I felt it, something was coming. Something worse than a storm. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, small, indistinct, like a shadow. But as it drew nearer, it took form. A figure, not unlike the one I had seen in the storm, but different. This one was more solid. It had substance. Its body was shifting, like the storm itself was bleeding into it, twisting its features into something grotesque. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. The air was too thick. The pressure was suffocating. The figure moved closer, its limbs long and twisting in ways that didn't make sense, like they were bending the laws of reality itself. Its face was still absent, just a blank surface of shifting light, but it was staring at me, or at least, I could feel it watching. I could feel its gaze in every corner of my mind. You're not supposed to be here. The voice echoed again, this time from the figure itself. But it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking to something else. Something beyond me. Before I could understand what was happening, the world around me seemed to warp. The rift in the sky grew wider, closer, until it wasn't just above me anymore, it was in front of me. It was a swirling, living mass of energy filled with shapes and lights that I couldn't comprehend. And beyond it, in the dark void, something watched. You are the first, Jack. The first to cross. But you won't be the last. With that final thought, the figure raised its hand and the world around me collapsed. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The constant hum of energy, the distant crackling of lightning, the oppressive weight of the air, all of it was gone. Instead, there was only an eerie, suffocating stillness. I couldn't move at first. My body felt like it had been encased in concrete, frozen in place, unable to respond to my commands. Every inch of me ached as if the very marrow in my bones had been stretched and twisted. Then, slowly, I became aware of my surroundings, or rather, the lack of them. I was floating, suspended in an endless void. There were no stars, no light, no sky, just an infinite blackness that swallowed everything, including my sense of self. I couldn't tell up from down. I couldn't even tell if I was breathing or if I was still alive. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't through thoughts. It was closer. A whisper brushing against my ears like a cold breath. You have crossed beyond the veil. The words were familiar, yet they felt like they were in a language I hadn't learned. They resonated in my mind, vibrating with an ancient force I couldn't comprehend. I shuddered, but my body still refused to obey. This is not your world. This is the other side, where everything that was and will be exists in the same moment. The presence wrapped itself around me like a shadow, filling the space with its weight. It felt like I was being observed, not by one, but by many. The sensation of being watched intensified, a cold, unshakable feeling that seemed to press down on me from every direction. You are not the first to come here, the voice continued, but you are the first to remain. I felt a pulse of dread course through me. Something in the air shifted, moved, as if the very fabric of the void around me had come alive. My heart raced, though I wasn't sure if it was my heart or if it was the pulse of the place itself. The silence had become deafening, and yet I could feel a low hum beneath the stillness, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. I had no idea where I was. No idea how I had gotten here. The storm, the rift, the creature, it all felt like a distant dream now. Or perhaps a nightmare. But there was no escaping it. The air, the very space around me, felt foreign, suffocating, as though I no longer belonged to any place I had ever known. You were brought here by your own curiosity, your desire to uncover the unknown, the voice whispered, its tone dripping with something ancient, something terrifying. But now, you are part of it. Part of the storm. Part of what lies on the other side. Suddenly, the darkness around me seemed to shift. The void pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, and something began to take shape in front of me. It was a figure, a silhouette, a shadow of a figure that flickered like a broken light. As it came into focus, I saw it was not just a figure. It was a collection of figures, thousands, perhaps more, twisting and folding into each other, as if their forms were made of liquid, flowing together, breaking apart, and then reassembling in an endless dance of motion. You are not alone, the voice continued, as if it were responding to my shock. You will never be alone again. I tried to scream, to fight, but there were no words. My body remained frozen, as if it was trapped in a space between breaths. The figures before me grew clearer, more distinct. They weren't human, they weren't anything I could have ever imagined. They were distorted, grotesque, shapes without definition, faces without features, eyes that didn't blink but stared at me with an unsettling intensity. They were watching me. They were waiting. You will become one with us, the voice whispered once more. You will join us in the endless storm. I couldn't understand what it meant. What was happening? Where was I? The figures stretched out, their shapes growing ever closer, their presence expanding until I felt as if I was being pulled into them. The sensation was overwhelming, as if the very weight of their existence was pressing down on me. I wanted to fight. I wanted to escape. But I couldn't. The storm was in me now, in my blood, in my mind. The figures surrounded me, their cold touch brushing against my skin, but instead of feeling the chill, I felt nothing. There was no warmth, no cold. There was only the pressure, the crushing pressure of the storm that seemed to merge with my very soul. You are part of us now, Jack, the voice murmured. We are the storm. We are the end of all things. And you will never leave. And then, the world around me exploded. The figures, no, the storm itself, collapsed in on me, folding everything into a single, crushing point of light. I felt my body twist, break, and reform into something else entirely, something beyond understanding. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the sound of my own name, Jack, whispered by 1,000 voices, all calling me into the void. And then, there was nothing. When I woke again, it wasn't the same as before. There was no void. No figures. No storm. only the quiet hum of the world, distant and unfeeling. I opened my eyes, slowly, unsure of where I was. My surroundings were familiar, yet distant. The familiar green of the Ohio woods spread out before me, the same trees, the same dirt paths, but something was wrong. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. There was no breeze, no bird song. The world felt empty. I stood up, my legs shaking, my head pounding with a dull throb. I could taste the remnants of that unnatural storm in the back of my throat, bitter and metallic. My fingers twitched as I touched my face, feeling the coolness of my skin, the absence of any physical injury. But something inside me had changed. I could feel it, deep within, something had shifted. I was no longer just Jack. I had become something else, something more and less all at once. The memory of the storm flooded my mind. The darkness, the figures, the voices, the cold touch of the entities that had surrounded me. I had heard them, felt them, and now, in the silence of the woods, I could still hear their whispers in the back of my mind. Faint, like the sound of a storm just beyond the horizon, but growing stronger with each passing second. They weren't gone. They were still there, inside me, waiting. I turned around, expecting to see the camp I had set up earlier. But there was nothing. The area around me was entirely still, and the trees seemed to stretch into infinity. No sign of my team. No sign of anything. It was just me. Alone. I walked for hours, or what felt like hours. The woods had become an endless maze, the same twisted trees and dense underbrush repeating in every direction. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost sponge-like, as if the earth itself had absorbed the storm's energy, warping it into something unnatural. And then I saw it. A faint flicker of light, deep in the distance. I rushed toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was my team. Maybe I had lost everything. But as I got closer, the light didn't get any brighter. It remained the same, distant, cold, distant. As I reached the clearing, the light suddenly dimmed, and I froze. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and unnervingly familiar. It was me. But not me. It was a distorted reflection, an echo of my own body, twisted and wrong. The figure's eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to devour everything around them. It stood motionless, as if waiting. The air around me grew colder. The ground beneath me felt like it was pulling me down, and I stumbled back, but my feet refused to move. The figure's mouth opened, slowly, painfully, as if the very act of speaking was a struggle. "You are one of us now," it said, the voice identical to mine but distorted, laced with 1,000 whispers, "and there is no escape." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. Instead, I stood frozen, staring at the hollow eyes of this twisted version of myself. "You belong to the storm now. You are the storm." "The end of all things," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, the whispers crashing against my mind like a wave. And then it reached out. The moment its hand touched me, I felt every ounce of my being tear apart. My body convulsed as an overwhelming wave of darkness surged through me. The world spun, the storm's presence growing inside me, expanding until I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. The air buzzed with energy, the very ground under my feet trembling with the force of its power. "Welcome to the end," the figure whispered, its voice fading into a cacophony of voices that filled my mind. I tried to scream. I tried to break free, but all that came out was a sound, no words, just an endless, desperate scream that echoed within my skull, reverberating until the darkness consumed me whole. And then, just as it had begun, it stopped. The silence returned. I was alone again. The woods were still. The figure was gone. The storm had faded. But something was different. The world felt wrong. My body felt wrong. My skin tingled with an unnatural energy. The storm, whatever it had been, still lived inside me. It wasn't just in my mind, it was in my blood. In my very essence. I was the storm now. The storm from the other side. And there was no going back. The forest stretched on, endless and suffocating, and I realized the truth. This place, this world, was never meant to be my home. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And the storm? It was just beginning. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.